What if the worst day of your life was actually the first day of the life you were always meant to live? Nathan Mercer was 32 years old, standing on a stranger's porch, holding a cardboard box full of broken promises when the wrong woman opened the door and accidentally saved his life. He didn't come looking for a second chance. He didn't even believe he deserved one. He just wanted to return a box, drive home, and disappear back into the quiet exhaustion of being a single father who had forgotten what it felt like to want something for himself. But life, as it turns out, had a completely different plan. Hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The cardboard box sat in the passenger seat of Nathan's truck, like a passenger that refused to speak. It wasn't heavy. That was the thing that kept catching him off guard every time he glanced over at it during the 2.5-hour drive. He'd expected it to feel heavier somehow, the way grief always feels heavier in your chest than it does in your hands. But the box weighed maybe 4 pounds, 5 at the most. A few photographs still in their frames. A wool scarf Elena had left at his apartment back when things were still good between them. A silver bracelet he'd bought her for their 2nd anniversary that she'd stopped wearing sometime around their 4th year and never explained why. A handwritten letter she'd given him on a Tuesday afternoon 18 months ago when they'd both been trying very hard to make something work that had quietly stopped working a long time before that. He hadn't read the letter again since the night she'd given it to him. He wasn't going to read it today either. The drive took him through 3 counties he didn't know particularly well. Flat stretches of farmland interrupted by small towns with gas stations and barbecue joints, and the occasional Baptist church with a message board out front offering something inspirational to passing drivers. Nathan barely registered any of it. He had the radio on low, some country station playing songs he didn't recognize, and he drove the way a man drives when he's not really thinking about the road, on muscle memory and the dull forward momentum of someone who just wants to get something over with. His daughter Lily was 7. She was at school right now, which was part of why he'd chosen today. He'd wanted to do this without her in the back seat asking questions he didn't have clean answers to. Lily was sharp the way kids raised by single parents often are. She'd learned early to read the temperature of a room, to know when her father was carrying something heavy, even when he was smiling. He didn't want her watching him return this box. He and Elena had ended things 4 months ago. That part had actually been, and he hated himself a little for this, something close to a relief. Not because he hadn't loved her. He had. But the last year of their relationship had been 2 people who genuinely cared about each other, slowly realizing that caring about someone isn't always enough, and the exhaustion of pretending otherwise had worn them both down to something thin and fragile. When Elena finally said the words out loud on a Sunday evening in his kitchen while Lily was asleep upstairs, Nathan had felt grief. Yes. But underneath the grief, something he could only describe as the loosening of a knot he'd been carrying in his shoulder blades for the better part of 12 months. They'd handled it well, considering. No screaming, no cruelty. Elena had cried and he'd held her for a while, and they'd talked until nearly 2 in the morning about what went wrong and what they'd meant to each other, and how much they hoped the other person found something real and lasting. It was, by most measures, a mature and civilized ending. That didn't make returning the box any easier. Elena had moved to stay with a friend temporarily. Something about a family situation. She'd mentioned it briefly in a text a few weeks back, and he hadn't pressed for details. She'd asked him gently if he could drop off the last of her things when he had a chance. He'd said yes, and then let 3 weeks go by before he finally loaded the box into his truck on a Thursday morning, kissed Lily on top of her head, watched the school bus pull away from the corner, and drove. The address she'd given him was in Mill Haven, a town Nathan had passed through once or twice but never spent any real time in. It was a quieter, greener kind of place than where he lived, the kind of town where the houses sat back from the road behind old oak trees, and the lawns were the sort of deep, thick green that takes decades of maintenance to achieve. He found the house without much trouble, a large colonial-style place with a wraparound porch and window boxes full of something flowering that he couldn't name. Nice house. Much nicer than he'd expected, but then he didn't really know whose house it was, only that Elena was staying there. He sat in the truck in the driveway for a moment. There was a dark green SUV parked near the garage that he didn't recognize. Elena drove a gray sedan. He figured maybe it belonged to whoever owned the place. He grabbed the box, got out, and walked up the porch steps. He knocked. He waited, listening to the birds in the oak trees and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. And he told himself this was just a transaction. A small, clean transaction. Hand over the box, say something polite, drive home. That was all this needed to be. The door opened. The woman standing there was not Elena. She was around 30, maybe a year or two either side of that, with dark hair pulled back in a loose knot and reading glasses pushed up on her head like she'd just been interrupted in the middle of something. She was wearing a plain gray linen shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and jeans that were actually jeans. Not the expensive, carefully distressed kind, but regular jeans with a small stain near the left knee that looked like it might be ink. She was holding a coffee mug in one hand and a paperback book in the other, using her thumb as a bookmark. She looked at him with a kind of calm, direct attention that Nathan found immediately disarming, like she wasn't going to pretend she'd been expecting him, but also wasn't going to make it awkward. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Nathan said. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for Elena Vasquez. She asked me to drop something off. I might have the wrong address." The woman shook her head slightly. "No, you've got the right place. Elena's not here right now, though. She had to run out. Family thing. She should be back in a few hours." She looked at the box in his arms without any apparent curiosity about its contents, which he appreciated. "Do you want to leave it, or would you rather come back?" "I can leave it," he said. "Okay." She stepped back a little. "You want to set it inside? It looks like rain later." He glanced up at the sky. It did look like rain. He hadn't noticed. "Sure," he said. "Thank you." He followed her inside into a wide front hallway with dark hardwood floors and the kind of comfortable, lived-in disorder that tells you people are actually using a space, a pair of rain boots near the door, a stack of folders on the hall table, a canvas tote bag hanging from the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. She led him through to a sitting room off the hallway, and he set the box down on the floor near the wall, straightening up and feeling the particular awkwardness of a man who has just placed a box full of the evidence of a failed relationship in a stranger's house. "I'll let Elena know you came by," the woman said. Then, "Do you want some iced tea? I just made a pitcher." He had not expected that. He hesitated, already forming the automatic no thank you that politeness and a desire to escape social discomfort had trained into him over decades. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she asked, like it was the most natural thing in the world to offer iced tea to a man she'd never met who just appeared at the door with a box. No performance in it, just a question. "Yeah," he said. "Sure, that'd be nice." She nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer and turned toward the kitchen. He followed her, not quite sure why. The kitchen was large and bright, windows on two sides, a round wooden table near the back with chairs that didn't all match. There were fresh herbs in small pots on the windowsill, basil, maybe rosemary, and a cutting board on the counter with the remnants of what looked like it had been a tomato. The pitcher of iced tea was already on the table. She poured 2 glasses and set one in front of him and sat down across from him with her own, setting the paperback down cover side up on the table. He looked at the cover. Something about architecture. He didn't know enough about the subject to recognize the specific book. "I'm Victoria, by the way," she said. "Nathan," he said. "Nathan." She nodded once, not repeating it like some people do, just acknowledging it. "You drove a while to get here." "About 2.5 hours. That's a long drive for a Thursday." "Yeah," he said. He wrapped both hands around the glass and stared at the condensation forming on the outside of it. "It is." She didn't push. She didn't say anything at all for a moment, just drank her iced tea and looked out the window at the backyard, where the oak trees were starting to move a little in whatever wind was coming ahead of that rain she'd mentioned. It was a comfortable silence, in the way that comfortable silences almost never are between strangers, and Nathan wasn't sure what to do with that. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Sure." "What made you happiest before life got complicated?" He looked up from his glass. She wasn't looking at him with therapeutic interest or the slightly too intense curiosity of someone who wants to seem deep. She was just looking at him the way you look at someone when you've asked them a genuine question and you're willing to wait for an honest answer. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. The question had caught him somewhere he wasn't defended. He'd been braced for some version of "Are you okay?" or "Is everything all right?" or some other formula that people use when they want to acknowledge that something difficult is happening without getting too close to it. He had not been braced for this. "I used to make furniture," he said. He was a little surprised to hear himself say it. He hadn't said that sentence to anyone in a long time. "Furniture," she said. Not like a question exactly, more like she was turning the word over. "With my grandfather," he said. "When I was a kid and then through my early 20s before—" He stopped, shrugged. "Before other things took over." "What kind of furniture?" "All kinds." He had a workshop behind his house. Tables mostly, chairs. He built a rocking chair when I was about 12 that— He stopped again because the memory had arrived with more warmth and force than he'd anticipated, and he wasn't prepared for it. It was a good rocking chair. Victoria smiled at that, not in a way that was polite or performative. It was a small, real smile, the kind that reaches someone's eyes before it reaches their mouth. "What happened to the workshop?" "He died about 7 years ago." Nathan turned the glass on the table, making a slow circle with it. "I kept some of his tools. They're in a storage unit. I haven't—" He exhaled. "I haven't done anything with them." "Why not?" He looked at her. It was a simple question, and somehow also the most honest thing anyone had asked him in a long time, because the honest answer was not something tidy. The honest answer was, because somewhere between losing his grandfather and the pregnancy that had made him a father at 25, and the job that paid the bills but crushed something in him, and the relationship that had just filled a box in her hallway, he had simply stopped believing that he was still the person who got to want things for himself. But he didn't say that. What he said was, life got busy. Victoria didn't push on that. She just nodded slowly, like she was filling in the spaces between his words on her own, and had the grace not to make him fill them in out loud. They sat there for another few minutes, talking in the unhurried way of people who don't have an agenda. She asked about his daughter, and his face changed when he talked about Lily, the tightness going out of it. And she told him a little about herself, carefully, in the way of someone who has learned to be cautious about the details she shares with strangers. She mentioned that she'd been staying here helping a friend through a difficult family situation. She didn't offer more than that, and he didn't ask. He finished his iced tea. He thanked her. He stood to go. And then she said, "Would it be all right if I gave you something?" She went to the counter and came back with a business card, plain and cream-colored, and set it on the table in front of him. "No pressure at all, but if you're ever curious, call that number and ask about the Greystone Center. Just ask about the woodworking program." He picked up the card. The name on it said Victoria Langford. Below that, the Langford Foundation. He didn't know what the Langford Foundation was. He didn't want to ask in a way that would make him seem like he'd been living under a rock, though some instinct told him he probably should know. "What is it?" he asked. "A rehabilitation center," she said, "for veterans and first responders who are recovering. We've been trying to find someone to run a woodworking program there for about 8 months. We haven't found the right person." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not saying you're the right person. I don't know that. But I have a feeling you might be worth talking to." Nathan looked at the card, then at her. "I'm not a professional instructor. I haven't built anything in years." "I know," she said. "That's not what I said I was looking for." He put the card in his jacket pocket, said goodbye, and walked back to his truck. He sat there for a minute in the driveway, looking at the house with its wraparound porch and the window boxes with the flowers whose names he didn't know, and then he backed out and drove home. He didn't take the card out of his pocket the whole way home, but he didn't throw it away either. The Greystone Center was located about 40 minutes from Nathan's house, which meant he'd been driving past its general vicinity for years without ever knowing it was there. It sat on a long, low piece of property that backed up against a tree line, a series of connected single-story buildings in pale brick that looked from the road more like a well-maintained community center than anything else. There was a vegetable garden to one side that someone was clearly maintaining with real attention, and a small parking lot with a handmade wooden sign near the entrance that said, "Greystone Center for Recovery and Renewal," in letters that had been routed rather than painted. Nathan sat in his truck in the parking lot for nearly 10 minutes before he got out. He'd waited a week before calling the number on the card. He'd told himself that was reasonable. that he was being measured, thoughtful, not impulsive. But the truth was that he'd taken the card out of his jacket pocket every single day that week and looked at it, and something in him that he'd thought was long past reactivation had started making noise in a way he didn't quite know what to do with. He hadn't told anyone he was coming here, not his mother, who would ask too many questions, not his buddy Derek, who would be supportive in an enthusiastic way that Nathan wasn't ready for. He hadn't even processed it out loud with himself, really. He just called the number, talked to a woman named Sandra, who sounded warm and efficient in equal measure, arranged a visit for Thursday afternoon when Lily had her after-school art program, and then put the phone down and gone back to his kitchen to make dinner. Now, he was here, and his hands were sweating slightly on the steering wheel, which was embarrassing for a man who was 32 years old and had driven a delivery truck for 6 years and was, objectively, just visiting a community center. He got out of the truck. The front entrance had a small overhang and a pair of wooden benches on either side of the door, the kind that had been built with care rather than purchased from a catalog. He noticed that immediately, without thinking about it. The grain of the wood, the way the joints sat. His grandfather's voice appeared somewhere in the back of his mind, quiet and particular. Look at how a joint sits, and you'll know whether the person who made it was in a hurry or not. These benches had not been made in a hurry. Inside, Sandra turned out to be a compact woman in her late 50s with silver hair and the brisk warmth of someone who has spent her career working with people in difficult circumstances and developed genuine affection for humanity as a result rather than the opposite. She shook Nathan's hand, told him she was glad he'd come, and walked him through the facility with the efficiency of someone who knew every square foot of the place and what it meant. The rehabilitation center served veterans and first responders, firefighters, paramedics, police, who were recovering from physical injuries, trauma, or both. It was not a hospital. It was a place people came after the acute phase of whatever they'd survived, a bridge between the medical system and getting back to something recognizable as a life. Some of the people there were dealing with the aftermath of combat. Some had been injured in the line of duty. Some were working through things that left no visible mark but were real in every way that mattered. The concept behind the woodworking program, Sandra said, walking him through a large room that was currently being used as a dining area, is occupational therapy in the broadest sense. Working with your hands, building something real and tangible, seeing it take shape through effort. We've seen really significant outcomes with it in other centers, but finding the right instructor has been, she paused, choosing the word carefully, challenging. What's made it challenging? Nathan asked. She looked at him sideways as they walked. People who are very technically skilled at woodworking don't always know how to work with people who are struggling. And people who are very good at therapy don't always have genuine skill with wood. The participants notice. They notice immediately. These are people who've operated machinery, built things, fought fires. They know the difference between someone who's competent and someone who's performing competence. Nathan nodded. He understood that distinction. He'd worked for enough supervisors in his life to have felt it from both sides. She showed him the space that was designated for the program. A long room with high windows and good natural light, the kind of space that had clearly been a storage area at some point and been converted with more thought than money. There were 2 workbenches along one wall, basic tools hung on a pegboard. There was a smell of sawdust in the air that hit Nathan somewhere between the sternum and the back of the throat, ancient and immediate at once. He stood in the doorway of that room for a moment. His grandfather had smelled like sawdust. Not always, not when he was dressed for church or taking Nathan's grandmother to dinner, but in the way that people who spend real time doing something carry it on their skin and in the fibers of their clothes. His grandfather had smelled like sawdust in the way that some people smell like coffee or motor oil or the particular chemicals of a dental practice. Nathan had loved that smell without ever consciously cataloging it, and standing in this doorway, it returned to him with a precision that nothing else in 7 years had managed. The tools we have are basic, Sandra said. We'd have a budget to expand the equipment with some planning, and we have about 12 participants who've expressed interest in the program, though we'd start smaller than that, I think. What does the schedule look like, he asked. We were thinking 2 mornings a week to start, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 3 hours a session. She looked at him evenly. We're flexible within reason. We understand you have other responsibilities. He'd mentioned Lily on the phone. Not in detail, just enough for Sandra to understand that he had a daughter and a schedule that wasn't fully his own. "What happened to the last instructor you tried?" he asked. Sandra paused for a half second. "We had one candidate we were fairly serious about 3 months ago. Former cabinet maker, 30 years of experience. He came in for a trial session and..." She stopped. He was technically excellent, but one of the participants asked him a question about why a particular joint was failing. He'd been working on a small shelf, very simple project, and the instructor corrected him in front of the group. In a way that was... She searched for the word again. Precise, but not kind. And the participant didn't come back. 2 others stopped coming within the week. She said it without drama, just as a fact. These are people who have had a very hard time feeling competent, who are working very hard to feel like themselves again. The margin for error on the trust side is narrow, Nathan said. Extremely narrow. He looked at the room again. The workbenches, the tools on the pegboard, the high windows with the afternoon light coming through at an angle. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the specific patience his grandfather had possessed. Not the patience of a man who was pretending nothing was wrong, but the patience of a man who had decided in some fundamental way that the process was just as valuable as the product, and had never found a reason to revise that decision. He thought about the afternoon when Nathan had been 16 and had split a piece of walnut he'd been trying to work with a chisel, split it right down the middle in a way that could not be recovered, and had said a word he was not supposed to say, and kicked the workbench and felt the particular fury of someone who has worked hard at something and failed. And his grandfather had picked up the 2 halves of the walnut, held them up to the light, and said, "There's your grain. You went against the grain. Feel that now. Remember what that feels like going in, not just what it looks like going wrong. No heat in it, just the lesson." "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said. "Of course," said Sandra. "The person who recommended me for this..." He hesitated. "Victoria Langford. What's her actual involvement here?" Sandra looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, something between surprised and careful. "Ms. Langford founded the Langford Foundation, which funds this center and several others like it. She's involved in the operational side to whatever degree she chooses to be, which varies." She paused. "Why do you ask?" "She didn't tell me that," he said. "When we met, she introduced herself as Victoria, said she was helping a friend. She gave me her card, but I didn't..." He stopped. "I didn't look her up." Sandra nodded slowly. "She tends to move quietly," she said, which was not exactly an explanation, but was clearly all Sandra was going to offer. Nathan drove home that afternoon with the afternoon sun in his eyes and Lily's after-school schedule ticking in the back of his mind. He had 40 minutes before he needed to pick her up. He stopped at a gas station, bought a bottle of water, sat in the parking lot, and called his mother, who answered on the second ring. "I might be starting a new thing," he said. "What kind of new thing?" "Teaching. Sort of woodworking." There was a pause. He could hear the television in the background at his mother's house, the low murmur of a news channel. "Woodworking," she said. "Yeah." Another pause. Then, "Like with Pop?" "Yeah." "Nathan." Her voice had shifted slightly into a register he recognized, the one she used when she was trying not to say too much, trying to give him room to figure something out without her fingerprints all over it. "That's... okay. Are you okay?" "I think so," he said. "Yeah, I think I might be." He started the following Tuesday. He arrived 40 minutes early, which was 40 minutes earlier than he'd intended to arrive, pulled by some anxiety he couldn't fully name. Not stage fright exactly, more like the specific alertness of someone who knows they're walking into something that matters and hasn't been in a room that mattered in a long time. He spent those 40 minutes reorganizing the tools on the pegboard in a way that made more practical sense, and by the time the first participant arrived, he had calmed down to a functional level of nervous. There were 5 of them that first morning. Marcus was 41, former Army, a big man with a prosthetic below his left knee who walked with a confidence that Nathan recognized as the practiced kind. the result of a lot of hard work and physical therapy, and a decision made at some point to not let the limp define how he entered a room. He had the handshake of a man who had once been expected to have a very firm handshake and hadn't fully let go of that expectation. He looked at the workshop with an expression Nathan couldn't immediately decode, somewhere between skepticism and something cautious that might, given the right conditions, be curiosity. Diane was 37, a former paramedic from somewhere in the northern part of the state. She had an injury to her right hand. Nathan could see it in the way she held it, slightly stiff, the fingers not quite closing all the way. She wore her hair in a short practical cut, and she sat down on the stool at the workbench nearest the door and immediately started asking questions about the tools. Not challenging questions, genuinely curious ones. The kind that came from someone who was accustomed to understanding how things worked before committing to them. There was a 28-year-old named Corey who had the particular quiet of someone who was getting through each day with real effort and not talking about it much. He'd been a firefighter. He sat down, folded his hands on the workbench, and looked at Nathan with something that was not hostile but was absolutely reserved. A look that said, clearly and without words, "I've been in rooms like this before. I've been promised things before. Show me something." The other two were a married couple in their early 50s, Ray and Juanita, who had both served, Ray in the Marines, Juanita with the National Guard, and had apparently enrolled together because, as Ray explained with a directness Nathan appreciated, she was not going to let me sit in the truck while she did it, and I wasn't going to send her in alone, so here we are. Juanita rolled her eyes at her husband with the deep familiarity of someone who has been doing it for 25 years and finds it endlessly effective. Nathan looked at all five of them. He thought about what Sandra had told him, about the instructor who had been technically excellent and not kind, about the participant who had not come back. He thought about his grandfather. He picked up a piece of rough-cut white oak from the stack near the wall, about 14 inches long, a couple inches thick, and set it on the workbench in front of him. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "I haven't taught anything in my life. I'm not a certified instructor. I spent a lot of years building furniture with my grandfather and then stopped for about a decade, and I have no particular idea whether I'm any good at this." He looked at the piece of oak. "What I know is that wood doesn't lie to you. If a joint is wrong, it's wrong. If you went against the grain, you went against the grain. But it's also patient." He paused, feeling slightly self-conscious about the word, but committed to it. "Wood doesn't care how long it takes you to learn. It'll wait." Nobody said anything. Corey's reserved expression had shifted just slightly, not to warmth, to attention. Nathan ran his hand along the oak. "Today, I just want to know what you already know, where you've worked with your hands before, what tools you're comfortable with, what you're not. We're not building anything today. Today we're just getting a sense of the material." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "How long before we actually make something?" "Depends on what you want to make," Nathan said. "I want to make something my kid can use," Marcus said. It came out quickly, like it had been sitting close to the surface. "Then probably not long," Nathan said. "What's your kid into?" Marcus looked at him for a moment, and something in his face loosened by a fraction. "She's 9. She's really into reading. She's always got books everywhere." "So we're talking a bookshelf," Nathan said. "I guess so, yeah." "That's a good first project." "Is it hard?" "Some of it is. Most of it's just careful." Nathan picked up the oak, felt its weight. "You learn careful pretty fast once the wood tells you what happens when you're not." That got a sound out of Juanita. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. Ray glanced at her sideways. They spent the morning the way Nathan had described, getting a sense of the material. He moved from bench to bench, asking questions more than answering them, listening to the ways people talked about their hands and their experience. Diane knew more than she'd let on initially. She'd grown up with a father who did carpentry on weekends, and some of it had stuck, though she kept qualifying it, kept saying, "I don't really know, I probably don't remember right." He noticed that. He made a note of it. Corey hadn't said much by mid-morning, but Nathan had watched him pick up a hand plane from the pegboard when no one was looking, turn it over in his hands, examine the blade with a focus that told you he'd used one before. "You know that tool?" Nathan asked. Corey set it back on the pegboard. "My uncle had one," he said. "We used to mess around in his garage." Did you build anything? A pause. A birdhouse, Corey said. Then, with a self-consciousness that seemed to cost him something. 2, actually. He kept one. What happened to yours? Corey looked at the handplane. Lost in the move, he said, which was clearly a chapter of its own that he wasn't opening. We can make another one, Nathan said. Corey looked at him. That's kind of a kid's project. The first one I ever made was a box, Nathan said. It was so bad my grandfather put his coffee in it to weight it down so it would stop being crooked. He picked up the hand plane and held it out. But the second one worked. Corey took the plane, looked at it for a moment. All right, he said. At noon, when the session ended and the 5 participants began gathering their things, Marcus stopped near the door. Same time Thursday? He said. Same time Thursday, Nathan said. Marcus nodded once and walked out. Nathan heard him say something to Diane in the hallway. He didn't catch the words, just the tone of it, which was the tone of 2 people who had arrived at something unexpected together. He stayed in the workshop for 20 minutes after everyone left, straightening tools that were already straight, feeling the quiet of the room and the quality of the light through the high windows, and something happening in his chest that he hadn't felt in so long that it took him the full 20 minutes to recognize it. He was looking forward to Thursday. He didn't see Victoria again until the 4th week. She came in on a Tuesday morning about halfway through the session, quietly, through the door at the back of the room, and stood near the wall without announcing herself. Nathan noticed her immediately. He was at Marcus's workbench, walking him through a mortise and tenon joint, and he registered her presence in his peripheral vision without breaking his attention on what Marcus was doing. She hadn't dressed differently than the day he'd met her. Plain dark shirt, jeans, hair up. She wasn't carrying anything. She stood with her hands in her pockets and watched with an attention that was genuine and unperforming. By the 4th week, the group had shifted. Marcus's skepticism had become something that was still guarded but also engaged. He was building his daughter's bookshelf with a seriousness of purpose that Nathan found quietly moving. Diane's right hand was giving her trouble, and they'd worked out approaches that used her left more than convention would suggest, and she'd stopped apologizing for it after Nathan had told her, once, directly, to stop apologizing for it. Corey had not made a birdhouse. He was making a small side table, and it was good. His hands knew things his brain was still catching up to, and watching him figure that out had been one of the better things Nathan had witnessed in recent memory. Ray and Juanita argued about literally everything. The best way to hold a chisel, whether pine or poplar, was more forgiving for beginners, who was supposed to bring the sandpaper, and were clearly having the time of their lives. At some point during a break, Victoria crossed the room and stood next to where Nathan was showing Corey something about grain direction on a piece of cherry wood. "How's it going?" she asked Nathan. Corey looked up, then back at the wood, doing the thing that perceptive people do when they sense a dynamic and decide to give it space. "Good," Nathan said. He found himself meaning it. "Really good, actually." "I can see that," she said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "You didn't tell me you funded this place," he said. "You didn't ask," she said. "Most people in that position would have led with it." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't." Corey had his eyes on the cherry wood, but the corner of his mouth had moved by approximately 2 millimeters, which from Corey constituted a significant expression. "Well," Nathan said, "for what it's worth, the program is working." He looked at the room, at Marcus with his bookshelf, at Diane and her left hand, at Ray and Juanita bickering cheerfully over sandpaper grit. "Whatever you saw that made you think it was worth trying, you were right." Victoria looked at the room for a moment. Something crossed her face that he couldn't fully name. Not pride exactly, though that might have been part of it. Something quieter, something that looked like it cost her something to feel. "I'm glad," she said. "I really am." She stayed for another half hour, and then left the same quiet way she'd come. And Nathan didn't think about it too hard, or tried not to, at any rate. He failed somewhat on the not thinking about it too hard front. But he drove home that afternoon with the windows down despite the cool weather, and Lily looked up from her book when he came through the door and said, "You look different," in the unfiltered way of 7-year-olds. "Different how?" he said. She studied him with the focused attention she brought to all serious questions. Like when you find something you were looking for, she said. He looked at his daughter for a moment. Yeah, he said. Maybe. The 8th week was when Marcus cried. Nathan hadn't seen it coming, which probably said something about how good Marcus had gotten at not showing things. They'd been in the middle of a Thursday session, the group larger now, 9 participants instead of the original 5, word having gotten around the center in the quiet, practical way that word gets around when something is actually working rather than just scheduled to work. Marcus had been finishing the final shelf board of his daughter's bookcase, the one he'd been working on since that first Tuesday, and Nathan had walked over to check the fit of the dado joint and found it was almost exactly right, just a hair too tight, and had said so. Sand the inner edge another pass, Nathan said. Light pressure. You want it to slide, not jam. Got it, Marcus said. He'd sanded it, tested the fit again. It slid clean. And Marcus had put both hands flat on the workbench and stared at the shelf for a long moment. And Nathan had started to say something about the next step. And then he'd seen Marcus's jaw working in the way that jaws work when someone is fighting something and losing. And he'd stopped talking. Nobody else in the room said anything either. Ray had looked up from his own project and then looked back down with the tact of a man who understood certain things about pride and difficulty. Diane had become very focused on the piece she was sanding. Corey, near the back of the room, just went still. Sorry, Marcus said. His voice was level, but it was working hard to stay that way. Don't be, Nathan said. It's just a shelf. Yeah, Nathan said. It is. Marcus pulled in a slow breath. She's going to put her books on it, he said. Not to Nathan specifically, just out loud. She likes this one series. The covers are all blue. I don't even know what it's called. She's got like 12 of them. She stacks them on the floor next to her bed because she doesn't have anywhere to... He stopped. She's going to have somewhere to put them. Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. He put a hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder, not a prolonged thing, just a touch, and then moved back to give the man his space. From the back of the room, Corey said quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear, My table's going to go in my living room. My sister keeps asking me if I need stuff for the apartment. I've been telling her no for 6 months. He paused. I think I'm going to tell her yes to the chair. It was the most Corey had said in a single stretch in 8 weeks. Diane looked up. I'm making a cutting board, she said, because I couldn't think of anything else and it seemed practical. But I think my mom's getting it. She's been cooking at my place twice a week since I got back, and I keep telling her she doesn't need to, and she keeps showing up anyway. A pause. The cutting board is for her. Nathan stood in the middle of the room and listened to his participants talk to each other. Really talk, the way people do when they've been through something difficult in proximity, and trust has built up without anyone making a formal announcement about it. And he thought about his grandfather's workshop behind the house, the smell of it, and the quality of the Saturday morning light in there, and the way his grandfather had never once made him feel like learning was a performance or a test. He hadn't understood until now what his grandfather had actually been teaching him. He'd thought it was woodworking. It was something else. It was how to make people feel like their hands knew things worth knowing. He was 32 years old, and he was just figuring this out. The session ran 20 minutes over because nobody wanted to stop, which was the kind of problem Nathan was glad to have. He called his mother on the drive home. The program is working, he said when she answered. I know, she said. How do you know? I haven't told you anything. Nathan, you call me when things are bad and you go quiet when things are fine. You've been quiet for 6 weeks. He heard the smile in her voice. That's the longest quiet streak since before Lily was born. He didn't answer that immediately because she wasn't wrong. Pop would have been good at this, he said. Pop was good at everything that required patience, she said. He wasn't good at taxes or arguing with the insurance company or parallel parking, but patience? Yes. He had more of it than anyone I ever knew. She paused. You have some of it too. You've just never been in a room that needed it this way. He thought about Marcus's hands flat on the workbench, about Corey in the back of the room, his jaw setting as he said something true out loud for what was probably the first time in months. Mom, he said. Yeah. I think I've been wasting a lot of time. Okay, she said. I'm not... I don't mean wallowing. I just mean I've been doing the survival version of my life for a while, and I sort of forgot that was a temporary measure. I know what you mean, she said. And yes, you have been. She said it without cruelty, which was what made her his mother, and not just a person who agreed with him. But you figured it out at 32, which is considerably earlier than your father figured anything out, so we're ahead of schedule. He laughed at that, which he hadn't expected to do. Go home to your daughter, his mother said. She told me yesterday she wants to show you something she made at school. What did she make? I'm not telling you. Let her tell you. He drove home with the windows down again and thought about patience and wasted time and the particular arithmetic of a life that has lost some years to difficulty and how you calculate what's left and whether that calculation is even the right way to think about it. Lily met him at the door holding a small clay pot she'd made in art class, lopsided and glazed in 2 different shades of green that didn't quite match, one side taller than the other. She held it up with the total conviction of someone presenting a museum piece. It's for you, she said, for your tools or something, at the place. He took it from her very carefully and turned it in his hands. Lily, this is really well made. Mrs. Patterson said it was rustic, she said, which was clearly what Mrs. Patterson had offered instead of saying it was crooked. Mrs. Patterson doesn't know what she's talking about, Nathan said. Rustic is a style choice. This is intentional. Lily looked at the pot with recalibrated eyes. Yeah, she said, it is. He put it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink that night, and he left it there. The 10th week, Victoria came back. She arrived on a Tuesday again, same quiet entrance through the back, same hands in pockets, same steady attention. The group had grown to 11 by then, the room carrying a different energy than the first morning. There was noise in it now, the good productive kind, the sound of people who are comfortable enough to argue about technique and laugh at their own mistakes, and occasionally swear when something doesn't cooperate. Nathan was helping a newer participant, a 24-year-old former Marine named Jesse, who had arrived 3 weeks ago with the specific contained stillness of someone managing a very large amount of internal pressure through very deliberate external stillness. Work through the basics of a handsaw. Jesse had good instincts and terrible patience with himself, the combination that Nathan had started to recognize as almost universal in the participants who came through. They'd all had careers that demanded excellence, and they'd all hit moments that had made excellence feel impossibly far away, and the gap between who they'd been and how they felt now was the specific wound that nobody talked about directly, but that was visible in almost everything they did. Slower, Nathan said. You're pushing when you need to pull. I know, Jesse said, through his teeth a little. The knowing doesn't fix it. Feel which stroke is cutting and which is dragging. That's how you fix it. Jesse made the stroke again, slower this time, with more attention. The saw moved through the pine with a clean, consistent sound. There, Nathan said. Jesse looked at the cut. That's better. Yeah. I keep wanting to rush it. I know. Everybody does. Nathan leaned against the workbench. What did you do in the Marines? Jesse glanced at him sideways, not quite sure where the question was going. Logistics, he said. Supply chain coordination. Essentially making sure everything was in the right place at the right time. So you've spent your career being responsible for things happening on schedule. Basically, yeah. And now you're in a room where the wood doesn't care about your schedule. Jesse looked at the saw in his hands. A beat. That's annoying, he said. Yeah, Nathan said. It is, and also it's kind of the point. Jesse didn't answer that immediately, but something in his posture shifted, a fraction of the held tension going out of his shoulders, and Nathan moved on to check on someone else without pressing it further. He found Victoria standing near the pegboard wall, looking at the tools with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than polite attention. She'd picked up one of the marking gauges and was turning it in her hands. Do you know what that is? He said. No, she said, but it's satisfying to hold for some reason. Marking gauge. You use it to score a line parallel to an edge, old school way of measuring and marking before you cut. He held out his hand and she gave it to him. He ran the pin along the edge of a scrap piece, leaving a clean, light line. See? Takes the guesswork out of the cut. She watched him do it. The participants are different than they were the first time I came in, she said. 4 weeks makes a difference. It's not just the time, she said. She was looking at the room as she said it, at Jesse making his careful saw cut, at Marcus, whose bookshelf was done, who was now helping a newer participant with a measuring issue because he'd done exactly the same calculation wrong 6 weeks ago and remembered it. It's something you're doing. I'm just teaching the wood, Nathan said, which came out sounding almost clever, and he immediately felt a little self-conscious about it. But Victoria shook her head slightly. You're not just teaching the wood, she said. You're watching them. You see when someone's getting frustrated before they know they're getting frustrated. You redirect before anything goes wrong. She paused. I've been running programs like this for 8 years, and I know the difference between an instructor who's skilled and an instructor who's paying attention to human beings. You're doing the second one. Nathan didn't know what to say to that. He looked at the marking gauge in his hands. My grandfather did it first, he said finally. I'm just doing it the way he did. Who taught him? His father, I think, and whatever life gave him before that. He set the gauge down. I don't really know. I never asked. I should have asked. Victoria looked at him with a directness that had stopped catching him off guard around the third time he'd been on the receiving end of it. She didn't dress her attention up in anything. She just looked at you and you felt looked at. How's your daughter? She said. The question surprised him with how much he didn't mind being asked it. She's good, he said. She made me a pot. For pencils or tools or whatever, it leans to one side. Of course it does, Victoria said. She's what, 7? 7, yeah. My niece is 8, Victoria said. She made me a sculpture out of pipe cleaners last Christmas that she said was a horse. I still have it on my desk. She said it without sentimentality, just as a fact about her life. I told her it looked exactly like a horse. It did not look like a horse. Nathan laughed. It came out easier than laughing used to come. What did it look like? An extremely ambitious spider, Victoria said. I've grown fond of it. It was the first time she told him anything genuinely personal. Not information exactly, but something. A niece. A pipe cleaner horse on a desk. He filed it away not because he was keeping score, but because it landed somewhere warm. I have a board meeting in Chicago Thursday, she said, moving on before the moment could become something self-conscious. I'll probably be back in about 2 weeks. But Sandra says the center is getting requests from 2 other locations asking about the woodworking model. She looked at him steadily. I want to talk to you about that when I'm back, if you're open to it. What kind of talk? Expanding the program, training other instructors, potentially writing up what you've developed here into something other centers can use. She paused. I know that's a lot to put on someone who came in 9 weeks ago as a maybe. It is, he said honestly. You don't have to decide anything now. I know. He looked at the room. Jesse's clean saw cut. Marcus explaining something to the new participant with his hands on the wood. Diane's left hand moving with a steadiness that had taken weeks to build. But I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking, she said. She left 20 minutes later, and Nathan watched the door close behind her and stood there for a moment with the marking gauge still in his hand and the particular awareness that things were moving in a direction he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure he was prepared for, but which felt, and this was the part that kept surprising him, right. Not comfortable. Not easy. Just pointed in a direction that made sense. He set the gauge back on its hook. She seems decent, said Corey, from 2 workbenches over, without looking up from his table. Yeah, Nathan said. She is. Rich, though, Corey said. Yeah. Rich people who are decent are either the real thing or very good at seeming like it, Corey said, with the philosophical detachment of someone who had seen both and was withholding final judgment. I know, Nathan said. I'm watching. Corey considered this. Good, he said, and went back to his table. The 2 weeks Victoria was in Chicago were the 2 weeks that Nathan finally went to his storage unit. He'd thought about it for months, the way you think about something you know you're going to do eventually, but haven't quite manufactured the will for yet. The storage unit was a 12 by 12 space in a facility about 6 minutes from his apartment, climate-controlled, smelling of that particular combination of cardboard and sealed air and time that all storage facilities share. He paid $80 a month for it and had been doing so for 7 years, which meant he calculated one morning over coffee, roughly $6,720 to keep a collection of objects in a room he visited once a year at most. He went on a Saturday morning, Lily at his mother's for the weekend. He unlocked the unit and pulled up the rolling door and stood in the entrance looking at the stacked boxes and the furniture pieces covered in moving blankets, and at the back, on a wooden pallet to keep it off the concrete floor, his grandfather's tool chest. It was not a fancy thing. It was a plain pine chest about 4 feet long that his grandfather had built himself in approximately 1963, which Nathan knew because his grandfather had written the year in pencil on the inside of the lid along with a note that said, "For what comes next." The pencil had faded, but was still legible. Nathan had read that note maybe 100 times over the years, and still wasn't sure whether what comes next referred to the tools specifically or to his grandfather's life at that particular moment, or to something else entirely. He decided at some point that the ambiguity was probably intentional. He lifted the lid. The tools were wrapped in oilcloth the way his grandfather had always kept them. Each plane, each chisel, each card scraper in its own piece of cloth, the cloth secured with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. He picked up the first wrapped piece, unwound the cloth, and found the number 4 Stanley bench plane that had been his grandfather's primary tool for 30 years. Its iron worn slightly, but its body solid, the tote darkened from decades of hands. He held it for a while. He didn't try to think about anything in particular. He just held it and let himself be in the storage unit on a Saturday morning with the sounds of the facility outside, a door somewhere rolling up, somebody's radio, and the weight of the plane in his hands, which was exactly the same weight it had always been, which was the kind of constant that you don't appreciate until you've gone a long time without it. He loaded the tool chest into his truck, along with 3 other boxes he'd identified as relevant, and drove to the Greystone Center, which had given him a key after the 4th week because he'd started arriving early enough that it was getting awkward for the front desk staff. He spent the rest of that Saturday afternoon in the workshop, alone, going through the tools and cleaning the ones that needed it and arranging them alongside the center's existing equipment. The number 4 plane he kept separate. He wasn't sure yet whether he'd bring it into the program or keep it just for himself. He wasn't sure that distinction entirely made sense anymore, but he held on to it anyway. At some point in the late afternoon, the light through the high windows shifted to that particular amber quality that happens in the last hour before sunset in the fall. And Nathan was sitting on a stool with a chisel in one hand and a sharpening stone in the other, and he realized that he hadn't thought about Elena in 2 weeks. Not actively, not painfully, not in the way that he'd sometimes catch himself thinking about her in the months after they'd ended, a kind of phantom limb awareness of a thing that used to be there. Just 2 weeks of it simply not coming up. He put the chisel down and thought about that for a moment. It wasn't that it didn't matter, it had mattered. 5 years is not nothing, and the version of himself who had driven to Millhaven with a cardboard box of photographs and a silver bracelet had been genuinely tired, genuinely used up by the specific sadness of something that had failed slowly rather than dramatically. But that version of himself felt not distant exactly, more like he was standing in a different part of the same room now. The room was the same room. He was just further from the door he'd come in through. He went home, made himself dinner, and called Derek, who answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting for Nathan to call because Nathan had told him approximately nothing about the last 3 months of his life. And Derek had been exercising what was, for Derek, extraordinary restraint in not demanding details. "Okay," Derek said by way of greeting. "Tell me." So Nathan told him. Not everything, but most of it. The program, the participants, Marcus and his bookshelf, Corey's table, Diane's left hand. Derek listened in the particular way Derek had, asking questions at the exactly right moments and not asking them at the exactly right other moments, which was why Nathan had been friends with him since 9th grade. "And the woman who runs the foundation," Derek said at the end of it. Nathan had been waiting for that. "What about her?" "You've mentioned her 3 times in this conversation without me asking about her." "She's relevant to the program." "Nathan. Derek." "You've mentioned her 3 times," Derek said again, as if this were an irrefutable syllogism. "She's my employer, essentially." She gave you iced tea and asked what made you happy. She was being polite. No, she wasn't, Derek said. Nobody who is being polite asks that question. Polite people ask how your drive was. A pause. What's she like? Nathan looked at the clay pot on the windowsill. Honest, he said after a moment. Careful. She doesn't perform things. She's not performing anything. He struggled with how to say what he meant. She's just what she is. That's not nothing, Derek said. I know that's not nothing, Nathan said. I didn't say it was nothing. You're being careful. I'm being reasonable. There are 17 reasons to be careful. Name 4. Lily. That's 1. She's my employer, essentially, which I already said. That's complicated but not prohibitive. 2. I'm coming out of a relationship. It's been 4 months. 3. Nathan stopped. Her world is not my world. She runs a foundation. She has board meetings in Chicago. She knows things I don't know about and moves in circles I've never been in, and I am a man who teaches woodworking in a community center and picks his daughter up from school in a truck that has a dent in the back left panel that I haven't gotten fixed in 2 years because I keep forgetting. There was a silence. Nathan, Derek said. What? You just talked about her for 45 seconds without saying anything bad about her. You said her world is not your world. That's not a reason to be careful. That's a reason you're scared. Nathan didn't answer. 4 months ago, you drove 2.5 hours to give back a box, Derek said. You came home with a new direction for your life and a woman on your mind. I've known you since we were 14 and you got on a bike with no brakes at the top of Kendall Hill and rode it down because you said the hill was going to be there whether or not you were scared of it. Another pause. What happened to that guy? He became a father and started paying a mortgage, Nathan said. Those things happened to him, Derek said. They didn't replace him. They just made him busier. He let that sit. Talk to her. That's all I'm saying. Just talk to her. I talked to her. Not like that, and you know it. Nathan looked at the window, at the dark outside, at the lopsided clay pot on the sill. Good night, Derek, he said. I love you like a brother, Derek said, but you're being an idiot. Good night. Victoria came back on a Tuesday 2 weeks later, as she'd said she would. She arrived before the session ended this time and stood in her usual place near the back, but Nathan had gotten used to her presence in the room in a way that no longer required him to track it consciously. He was aware of her the way you're aware of weather, something in the background of your senses. After the participants left, she stayed. She sat on one of the stools at the front workbench and watched him straighten the tools. He'd started straightening the tools as a closing ritual, each one back in its place, the same way his grandfather had ended every session. And she waited until he was done before she said anything. Chicago went well, she said. Good. The board approved an expanded budget for 3 centers. The woodworking program is specifically included. Nathan leaned against the opposite workbench. How specifically? A dedicated line item. Materials, equipment, instructor compensation. She said the last part carefully. I want to be transparent with you about what I'm asking. I want to formalize your role here with real compensation, not the volunteer stipend you've been on. And I want your help building the framework to take this to the other centers. He'd known this was coming. He'd been turning it over since she'd mentioned it 4 weeks ago, in the gaps between other things, while he was making Lily's lunch, while he was driving, during the first 10 minutes of trying to fall asleep when his brain refused to turn off. My availability is limited, he said. I've got Lily's school schedule. Her health insurance comes from my job. I can't just... I know, she said. I'm not asking you to quit anything. I'm asking you to expand this at a pace that works for your life. We build it around you, not the other way around. She looked at him directly. I know what you have on your plate. I've asked Sandra to get me accurate information before having this conversation. He stared at her. You looked into my situation. I looked into what I needed to know to make you an offer that wasn't insulting, she said, without apology. If you'd prefer I'd had this conversation without knowing whether the timing worked for you, I can pretend that would have been better. He almost argued with that and then didn't, because she was right. And the fact that she'd done her homework before asking rather than just laying out an offer and expecting him to sort out the logistics himself it said something. "What does the compensation look like?" he said. She told him. It was substantially more than he'd expected. Not life-changing in the abstract sense of that phrase, but life-changing in the specific practical sense of Lily's college fund could start existing, the truck's dent could get fixed, he could take 2 fewer delivery shifts a month without the math falling apart. He was quiet for a moment. "Why me?" he said, not fishing for reassurance, genuinely asking. "You've been running programs like this for 8 years. You must know instructors who are more qualified." "I know instructors who are more credentialed," she said. "It's different." She reached out and picked up the marking gauge from the pegboard, turned it in her hands the same way she had the first time, and set it down. "Do you want to know what I saw when I walked into this room 4 weeks into your program?" "Yeah," he said. Marcus was teaching someone else," she said. "He was 3 months out of losing part of his leg, which is not something you get over in 3 months. But he was standing next to another participant and he was explaining something about wood grain, and he was using his hands to gesture the way my grandfather used to use his hands when he was trying to make something clear, and the other person was listening." She looked at Nathan. "That didn't come from a curriculum. That didn't come from a certification. That came from whatever you built in this room over 8 weeks, which came from whatever your grandfather built in that workshop over however many years." She paused. "You can't train that. You can only find it." Nathan looked at the marking gauge on the pegboard. "I'd need to think about it," he said. "Of course," she said. "A week, maybe 2. "Take what you need," she said. She stood up from the stool and picked up her jacket from the other workbench where she'd draped it and pulled it on. And Nathan watched her do it and thought about Derek's voice on the phone. "You're scared." He thought about the hill with no brakes. He thought about Lily at the door with the lopsided clay pot held out in both hands with the total conviction of someone presenting something true. "Victoria," he said. She turned. "I know this is probably not... I don't know what the protocol is here given that you essentially run this program and I work here, and I'm aware of the 17 reasons this is probably not something I should be saying, but..." He stopped, took a breath. "Would you want to have dinner sometime, not about the program?" She looked at him for a moment. He couldn't read her expression. He had gotten reasonably good at reading her over 11 weeks, and this was one of the times he couldn't. Then she said, "Yes." Just that. No performance around it. No elaboration. "Okay," he said. "Saturday?" she said. "Saturday works." She nodded once, the same nod she'd given him when she'd acknowledged his name, the first day, that single clean acknowledgement, and walked out. Nathan stood in the empty workshop for a long moment. Then he sat down on the stool she'd just vacated, put both hands on the workbench, and looked at the room around him. At his grandfather's number 4 plane, where he'd decided to put it after all, on the pegboard with the other tools. At Lily's clay pot that he'd brought in last week because this room was starting to feel like somewhere it belonged. At Jesse's half-finished project on the bench near the window. At Marcus's bookshelf, complete. Sitting in the corner because Marcus had said he wanted to leave it here for 1 more week before taking it home. Like he wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to the room it had been built in. He thought about a 32-year-old man who had driven 2.5 hours with a cardboard box on the passenger seat and arrived at a door expecting nothing. He thought about how wrong it is possible to be about what a day is going to be. The restaurant Nathan chose for Saturday was not impressive, and he knew it when he chose it. It was a place called Harlow's, a neighborhood spot about 8 blocks from his apartment with wooden booths and a menu that hadn't changed significantly since the mid-90s, and a bar that served exactly 4 kinds of beer on tap. None of them craft. He'd eaten there probably 200 times over 6 years. It was the place he took Lily when she wanted pancakes for dinner. The place he and Derek went after Derek's divorce to eat onion rings and not talk about it. The place that existed in his life the way certain places exist, as furniture rather than destination. He'd made the reservation, such as it was, which was more of a phone call to let them know he was coming, and the woman who answered had said, "Sure, hun," in a way that made reservation feel like the wrong word, and then spent approximately 48 hours second-guessing himself. Derek had weighed in, unprompted, via text, "Take her somewhere nice." Nathan had replied, "I am." Derek had sent back a photograph of a restaurant he clearly found with a 30-second search, a place with mood lighting and a prix-fixe menu and a sommelier. Nathan had texted back, "That's not me," and she'd know it. Derek hadn't replied for a while, and then, "Fair point. Don't wear the gray shirt." He did not wear the gray shirt. Victoria arrived at Harlow's at 7 on the dot, which he appreciated. She was wearing a dark blue top and dark jeans and earrings he noticed without being able to describe, and she looked around the restaurant when she walked in with an expression that was reading the room genuinely rather than managing it. And when she spotted him in the booth near the back, she walked over and sat down across from him and said, "I like this place," before she'd even taken off her jacket. "You haven't been here before," he said. "I know, I like it already." She picked up the menu, which was laminated and had a small smear near the bottom that suggested someone had been eating something while handling it earlier in the day. "The boots are real wood," she said. "Probably from the 80s, Nathan said. "Still real," she said. She set the menu down and looked at him with the directness he'd gotten used to, but which still had a quality of catching him slightly off guard every time, like a step, is there and still feel in your legs when you take it. "You look nervous," she said. "I'm not nervous," he said. She looked at him. "I'm slightly nervous," he said. "Me too," she said. That surprised him enough that he didn't have an immediate response to it, and she picked up the menu again and studied it with apparent seriousness, which gave him a moment to recalibrate. "How was the drive?" he said, because it was something to say. "Nathan," she said, not looking up from the menu, "we've been talking for 11 weeks. You don't have to ask me how the drive was." "Right," he said. "Sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just talk to me like you talk to me at the center. At the center, we talk about wood. We talk about a lot more than wood at the center, and you know it." She set the menu down again. "Tell me something I don't know about you." He thought about it genuinely, which meant the first 3 things that came to mind were things she probably did know: Lily, the program, his grandfather, and he had to go somewhere else. "I played guitar for 8 years and quit," he said. "I was genuinely bad at it and kept hoping I'd get better and didn't." 8 years is a long time to keep hoping," she said. "I'm persistent to a fault." "What made you finally quit?" "Lily was born, and I needed the space in the apartment for a crib, and the guitar was the thing that moved." He paused. "I don't miss it. I think I wanted to be someone who played guitar more than I actually wanted to play guitar. The crib was a good excuse." Victoria smiled at that. The real one, the one that reached her eyes first. "I have a piano I haven't touched in 4 years," she said. "I'm very good at it, and I hate that I don't play anymore." "Why don't you?" "The short answer is that I don't have time." She looked at her water glass. "The honest answer is that my mother was the one who taught me, and after she died, it felt wrong to play without her in the room. And then enough time passed that starting again felt like something that needed a significant moment attached to it, which is a stupid way to think about piano practice." He didn't say anything for a moment. She'd offered that plainly, the way she offered most things, without performing the grief or putting a frame around it to signal how he should receive it. "When did she die?" he said. 6 years ago, she said. She was 58, which is young and also somehow felt inevitable because she'd been sick for a while. "But you're never ready." She picked up her water glass. "You lost your grandfather." 7 years ago, he said. 7 years and you still have his tools and their oilcloth." He looked at her. "You noticed that?" "I notice things," she said without apology. "The way you unwrapped the number 4 plane before you put it on the pegboard, like it was a book you were worried about the spine on." Nathan didn't answer that. There was nothing to argue with in it, and the fact that she'd watched him closely enough to see it, not in a surveillance way, just in the way of someone who pays attention to the world around them, did something to him that he decided not to examine too closely while sitting in a restaurant booth. The food arrived and they ate and talked. Not carefully, not with the architecture of people performing a first date, but the way people talk when they've established enough baseline trust that they can afford to be interesting to each other. She told him about growing up in a household where money had always been present but never comfortable, which was a contradiction he hadn't known how to hold until she explained it as her father had built his fortune in a way that had cost him people, and the money in the house had always had a slightly guilty smell to it, like something that had come at a price that hadn't been fully paid. She'd inherited the foundation from him when he died and spent the first 3 years essentially rebuilding its purpose from scratch. When I was 22, I told my father that money was the least interesting thing about a person, she said. What did he say? He told me I could afford to think that because of his money. She cut into her food. He wasn't entirely wrong. That's what made it hard to argue with. She looked up. But he wasn't entirely right either. No, Nathan said. He wasn't. He was a complicated person, she said, in the tone of someone who has made peace with a thing without pretending it was simple. He did a lot of damage, and he built something that I've spent 8 years trying to turn into something worth the damage. I don't know if that's possible. I keep trying anyway. Is that why you don't lead with the money? Nathan said. When you're at the center. She thought about the question. Partly, she said, and partly because I grew up watching what money does to a room the second it's in the room. It changes the air. People perform around it. She looked at him steadily. The first day you came to the center, when you sat at that table, you were just a person who was tired and sad and used to be someone who made furniture. That was real. I didn't want to put money in that room. He thought about the kitchen table, the iced tea and the pitched glass. The question, what made you happiest before life got complicated? That question you asked me, he said. Yes? Did you ask it because you wanted to help with the program, or did you ask it because you just wanted to know? She was quiet for a moment. Both, she said. If I'm honest, both. The program was real. We'd been looking for 8 months, but you were carrying something in that box, and the question wasn't about the box. She paused. I was curious about you. I'm not sure I knew at that point how curious. How curious now, he said. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully decode, but which had something open in it. Considerably more, she said. They stayed at Harlow's until the kitchen closed, which was not something either of them had planned. The booth got more comfortable as the evening went on, the way Harlow's booths always did. Something about the way the wood had settled over decades of people sitting in them. Nathan's coffee cup had been refilled 3 times by a server named Phil, who had worked there since before Nathan had started coming and who checked on them periodically with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that some tables needed more time than others. At some point, late in the evening, Nathan said, "Can I ask you something that might be too direct?" "Yes," she said. "The first day. You gave me the card and told me about the program. Was that—" He tried to find the right way to frame it. "Were you just filling a position, or was there something else?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I was filling a position," she said. "Genuinely. We needed someone, and I thought you might be the right person." A pause. "But you sat at that table and talked about your grandfather the way people talk about things that matter to them when they've been not talking about them for too long. And I know that when I gave you the card, I wanted to see you again." She said it plainly, without flinching from it. "Whether that makes me calculating or just honest, I'm not sure." "Honest," he said. "That's just honest." She nodded. "I should get home," she said. "Lily has a thing tomorrow morning?" "Soccer. She's terrible at soccer. She likes the orange slices after." Victoria laughed. Actually laughed. A real sound, not the careful kind. "Of course she does. The orange slices are the whole point. The game is just the orange slice delivery mechanism." "Do not tell her that. She'll quit." They split the check, which she tried to argue about, and he won on grounds that he'd chosen the place and therefore had assumed the social contract, which she accepted with a roll of her eyes that he found unexpectedly delightful. Outside on the sidewalk, the air had gone cold the way fall air does in the evening, sharp and direct. They stood near her car and talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular. Marcus's bookshelf, whether pine was an underrated wood, a documentary about cabinet making she'd apparently seen and wanted to tell him about. And then she said goodnight and got in her car and drove away, and Nathan stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking back to his truck, and the feeling in him was not the high-wire feeling of something new and therefore fragile. It was something more like the feeling of sitting in a room that fit the shape of you. He texted Derek from the truck before driving home. "It went well." Derek replied 40 seconds later, "Told you." The following Tuesday, Nathan arrived at the center to find Jesse already there. This was unusual. Jesse was consistently punctual but not early. He moved with the precision of someone who had spent years in logistics and didn't waste time. And finding him in the workshop 20 minutes before the session started, sitting on a stool staring at his half-finished project, meant something. Nathan set his bag down and looked at the piece Jesse was staring at. It was a wall shelf with a small drawer built into the frame, an intermediate project more complicated than what he'd started with, which was part of why they'd chosen it. The shelf was structurally sound. The drawer was not. The drawer had been giving Jesse trouble for 2 weeks. "The fit's still off," Jesse said. "I know," Nathan said. He pulled the drawer out, examined the sides, put it back. The wood moved a little. It happens when the humidity changes. "I've remeasured it 4 times. "Measuring it again won't fix it. The measurement isn't wrong. The wood shifted." Jesse looked at the drawer. "I hate this project," he said. "I know you do." "I almost threw it out last Thursday." "I know that too. You didn't." Jesse looked at him sideways. "How do you know that?" "Because it's still here, and you're still here." Nathan pulled the drawer out again and set it on the bench beside the shelf. "We're going to plane the sides down, just a little. We're adjusting to what the wood actually is right now, not what it was when you measured it last week." "That seems like cheating," Jesse said. "It's not cheating. It's working with material instead of against it." Nathan picked up the block plane and held it out. "You do it. Light passes." Jesse took the plane. He made the first pass too hard and Nathan said nothing, just watched. The second pass was lighter. The third was right. "Feel that?" Nathan said. "Yeah." That's what a pass that's taking something feels like. Not forcing, just taking. They worked on the drawer for the next 15 minutes before the other participants arrived, and by the time Marcus came through the door stamping the cold off his boots, the drawer fit clean. Jesse slid it in and out 3 times without saying anything. Then he said, "My daughter's first birthday is in 3 weeks." Nathan was straightening the bench behind him. He didn't react visibly to the shift in conversation because he'd learned that you don't make too much of these shifts. They happen in the workshop the way things happen in places where people's hands are busy, the way certain conversations can only occur when there's a task to look at instead of each other. "How old is she?" Nathan said. "She'll be 1, Jesse said. He was still looking at the drawer. "I missed most of her first year. I was deployed and then He stopped. "I've been back for 7 months. She doesn't know me yet. Not really." "She will," Nathan said. "People keep saying that." "I know, it doesn't make it less true." Nathan moved to the other bench. "What are you going to give her for her birthday?" Jesse looked at the shelf, then at the drawer, then back at the shelf. "This," he said, slow, like he was figuring it out while saying it. "For her room. She doesn't have enough room in her room." "The drawer could hold things," Nathan said. "Yeah," Jesse said, "little things." A pause. "She collects these small plastic animals, my wife says. She carries them around." "The drawer's the right size for that." Jesse put both hands flat on the workbench the way Marcus had weeks ago, and Nathan felt the echo of it. These hands, this wood, this particular gesture that seemed to be what the body did when something clicked into place that had been loose for a long time. "Can we put her name on it?" Jesse said. "On the side of the shelf." "Is that something we can do?" "We can do that," Nathan said. "I'll show you how to use the routing bit." By mid-November, Nathan had accepted Victoria's offer. He'd thought about it for 18 days, which was longer than the week or 2 he'd said, but she hadn't pushed. He'd gone through this math 6 times with his mother, and once with Derek, and once alone at the kitchen table at midnight with a piece of paper and a calculator app on his phone. And the math worked, which was both a relief and mildly terrifying in the way that things are terrifying when they work out, because it removes your last practical objection. He'd also had a conversation with Lily, which he'd approached with more care than most things he did, because Lily was the category that required the most honesty. He'd sat with her after dinner on a Wednesday, when the dishes were done and she was at the kitchen table doing a worksheet for school, and he'd said, "Can I tell you about something?" She'd looked up from her worksheet with the full attention that children give to things when they sense the weight of them. "Okay," she said. He explained, in terms that fit a 7-year-old, what he was doing at the center and what it meant to expand it. He explained about his grandfather's tools. He explained, carefully, that it meant things would change a little in their schedule and that he needed to know if that was okay with her. Lily had listened to all of it. Then she said, "The people there, are they better now?" "Some of them," he said, "working on it. Because of the furniture." "Sort of. The furniture is kind of the thing they're doing while they get better." She thought about this seriously. "Like how I do better at math when I'm doing something else at the same time? Mrs. Patterson lets us hold clay while she does the lesson." "Yeah," Nathan said. "Like that." Lily went back to her worksheet. She made a few marks on it with her pencil. Then, without looking up, "Will you still pick me up from school?" "Every day," he said. "That doesn't change." "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Yeah." She kept writing. "Pop would like it that you're using his tools." Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at his daughter's bent head, her pencil moving across the worksheet, the lopsided clay pot on the windowsill. "Yeah," he said. He would. He signed the expanded contract on a Friday afternoon in Sandra's office, which smelled like coffee and the particular dry warmth of a building with old radiators. And Sandra shook his hand with both of hers and told him that the center's outcomes since the woodworking program started had improved measurably enough that she'd written a summary report for the foundation board, and the board had apparently passed it around the table with something close to excitement, which Sandra said was unusual for a board meeting. "I don't think I've earned that yet," Nathan said. "That's fine," Sandra said. "You will." Victoria was not there that day. She was at the second location in another state, beginning the preliminary work on launching the program there. They were talking regularly now, outside the professional context, though the professional context was still genuinely professional, a line they were both careful with in a way that felt measured rather than performative. She texted him about small things, a piece of figured maple she'd seen in a lumberyard window and photographed for him, a question about whether oak or ash was more forgiving for a novice. He texted her about smaller things, what Lily had said at dinner, a joke Corey had made in the workshop that had made the whole room laugh, the particular quality of the Thursday afternoon light through the high windows that he kept meaning to describe to her and kept failing to adequately. They'd had dinner 3 more times. Once at his place, which had required a level of apartment cleaning he was not willing to admit to anyone, during which Lily had been at his mother's, but had nonetheless left her stamp on the space in the form of crayon drawings on the refrigerator and a stuffed elephant on the couch named Gerald. Victoria had arrived and immediately asked about Gerald. He'd told her. She'd sat the elephant back on the couch in a position of dignity and said nothing more about it, which was exactly right. Twice at hers, the second time of which he'd met her cat, a massive gray animal named Stoic, who regarded Nathan with the profound indifference of a creature that has decided nothing is impressive. Nathan had tried to make friends with Stoic, and Stoic had walked into another room. Victoria had said, "That's actually pretty good for him. Usually he leaves before the introductions are finished." They hadn't talked about what they were, in the formal sense. He was aware that this conversation was out there, somewhere in the near future, waiting to be had. He was also aware that he was less afraid of it than he would have been 6 months ago, which said something he wasn't quite ready to say out loud yet. Marcus came in on a Tuesday in late November carrying his daughter with him. This was unexpected. Participants occasionally mentioned family. It happened more in the workshop than it might have in a more clinical setting, hands busy and defenses down. But bringing family to a session was not something Nathan had formally addressed in any direction. He hadn't thought to, which in retrospect he recognized as something of an oversight, though it hadn't come up until now. Marcus's daughter was 9 years old, and her name was Kezia, and she had her father's eyes and the specific alert quiet of a child who is old enough to understand that she is in a room that means something to her father without knowing the full geography of why. She sat on a stool near the door with her backpack on her lap and watched everything. Marcus had called ahead. Nathan would learn later. He'd talked to Sandra, who had said she'd check with Nathan and then hadn't, because Sandra had thought it was fine, and in retrospect it was fine, but it had produced the particular low-grade surprise of an unannounced change to a routine Nathan had invested a lot of care in. He'd managed it. "This is my daughter Kezia," Marcus said, with a directness that was also, Nathan could see, a kind of appeal. He was not asking permission exactly. He was explaining. "Hi, Kezia," Nathan said. "Hi," she said. Polite, watchful. "Your dad talks about you," Nathan said. "He talks about this place," she said. "All the time." "Yeah?" She looked around the workshop. At the tools, the workbenches, the pieces in various stages of completion. Her gaze landed on the bookshelf in the corner. Marcus's bookshelf, which he'd brought back to the center after 2 weeks at home because, he'd said, he wanted it in the room where he kept working. "Is that the shelf?" she said. "That's the shelf," Nathan said. She got up from the stool, backpack still on, and walked over to it. She ran her hand along the top edge, the way Nathan had seen people do when they were feeling the grain. Not because she'd been taught to, just because it was what the hand wanted to do when presented with real wood. She opened and closed the small cabinet door at the bottom. "You made this?" she said to her father. "Yeah," Marcus said. His voice was about 3 notes lower than usual. Kezia looked at the shelf for another long moment. Then she turned around and looked at Nathan. "Can I learn how to make something?" she said. Nathan glanced at Marcus, whose expression had gone to a place that was very full and very still at the same time. "Sure," Nathan said. "We'll start with something small." She made a small wooden box that morning, the simplest version, 4 sides, a base, no lid, using the scrap bin and a hand saw and the wood glue and clamps, and Nathan's instructions delivered in the same way he delivered all instructions, without condescension and without rushing. She worked with focus and a seriousness that was recognizable as her father's. When it was done and the glue was clamped, and they were waiting for it to set, she sat back on her stool and looked at it and said, "It's a little crooked." "Yeah," Nathan said. "First ones usually are." "My dad's shelf isn't crooked," she said. "Your dad's shelf was his 6th or 7th try. We count all the earlier ones." She looked at her father. "You made 6 of these?" "Parts of them," Marcus said. "Practice pieces." She looked back at the box. "I'm going to make another one," she said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "You are." At the end of the session, when most of the participants had gone and Marcus was gathering his jacket, Nathan heard Kezia say to her father quietly near the door, "Is it okay that I cried a little when I glued the corners?" "Yeah, baby," Marcus said. "Yeah, it's okay." "I don't know why I did." "I know," Marcus said. "I did too. The first time." Nathan was at the pegboard with his back to them, putting away tools one at a time, slowly, giving them the space of the room. The first week of December brought the first hard cold of the year, and a phone call from Victoria that he took standing in the Greystone Center parking lot at 8 in the morning, breath visible in the air, a cup of coffee going cold in his other hand. She was calling from the second center location, which was in its second week of the pilot program. She'd hired an instructor named Roz, a retired furniture maker and former Air Force mechanic, a woman in her early 60s who Victoria said had been difficult to find and was exactly right once found. "Roz had a breakthrough with one of the participants yesterday," Victoria said. There was something in her voice he'd learned to identify. Not excitement exactly, a specific kind of quiet satisfaction. The sound of someone watching something they believed in work. A man who hadn't talked in group sessions in 4 months. He asked Roz a question about the difference between a rabbet joint and a dado joint, and she answered him, and then he answered someone else's question, and then he was talking. "Wood doesn't care how long you've been quiet," Nathan said. "No," she said. "It doesn't." He looked at the parking lot, at the bare oak trees at the edge of the property, at the vegetable garden that someone had put to bed for the winter with a layer of straw mulch. "How long are you there for?" he said. "Another week," she said. "Then I have meetings in New York." A pause. "Then I'm back." "Okay." "Nathan," she said. "Yeah." "I keep meaning to tell you something and then not finding the right moment for it." He waited. "When I gave you that card," she said, "I'd been having a hard few months. The foundation, the board pressure, the expansion. I was doing the work, but I was doing it from inside a very small, very tight space, you know? Like I'd lost the thread of why it mattered." A pause. He could hear the wind on her end of the phone wherever she was standing. You showed up at that door with that box, and you were clearly someone who had been carrying things alone for too long. And when you talked about your grandfather, you lit up in a way that you didn't seem to notice you were doing. And I thought, here's a person who has something real and doesn't know how much it's worth. She was quiet for a moment. I knew within about 10 minutes that you were going to change something at the center. I didn't know it was going to change things for me too. The parking lot was very still. Nathan's coffee was completely cold now. When you get back, he said, I want to introduce you to Lily. A pause. Yeah? She's been asking about you, he said. She knows you exist. She's forming opinions. What kind of opinions? The thorough kind. She's 7, but she's been paying attention to how I talk about things for a year. She's made some deductions. He paused. She wants to know if you're the reason I look like I found something I was looking for. Victoria was quiet for a moment, and then she made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. That's a very sophisticated observation for a 7-year-old. She's a very sophisticated 7-year-old, he said. She made me a pot and told me it was intentional. I'd like to meet her, Victoria said. Very much. She'll have questions, he warned. Prepared questions. She might have written them down. I hope so, Victoria said. I prefer prepared questions. He was smiling, and he knew it, and he didn't try to correct for it because there was no one in the parking lot to see him do it except the bare oak trees and the dormant vegetable garden and the cold, pale sky of a December morning, which had no opinions about the matter. He went inside. Jessie's shelf was finished, Kazia's name and small animals carved along its side, gift-wrapped in brown paper and sitting in the corner waiting for the birthday party that was in 4 days. Jessie had stopped arriving early. He arrived precisely on time now, which was different. Corey's table was done and gone, taken home 2 weeks ago. A small handwritten note left on Nathan's workbench that said only thank you in Corey's minimal handwriting. Diane had made the cutting board for her mother, and then immediately started a second project, a small end table, because she said she didn't want to stop. Ray and Juanita were building a bench for their front porch, which they had, against all reasonable expectation, managed to agree on as a project after 3 weeks of arguing about what they were going to build. The bench was going to be good. They fought about every joint and every measurement with the enthusiasm of 2 people who had found a new arena for something they had always done together. Nathan walked through the workshop before the session started, touching the wood on the various projects the way he always did, not checking exactly, just taking the temperature of things. The room smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and the faint coffee someone always brought in a thermos. The tools were on their hooks. The light was coming through the high windows at its winter angle, lower and more direct than it had been in the fall, throwing longer shadows across the workbenches. He stood for a moment in the center of it. He was 32 years old. He had been in this room for almost 4 months. He had a daughter who made intentional pots and formed sophisticated opinions. He had his grandfather's tools on the pegboard and his grandfather's plane on the bench where it now lived permanently because Sandra had stopped pretending it belonged anywhere else. He had a woman in another state who said things plainly and kept a pipe cleaner horse on her desk and had, somewhere in the last 4 months, become the person he found himself trying to describe things to when something happened that was worth describing. He had, in ways he couldn't have predicted or planned for, and wouldn't have believed if someone had described them to him on the morning he loaded a cardboard box into the passenger seat of his truck, built something real. He thought that for a moment, just stood there and thought it without qualifying it or arguing with it or looking for the catch. Then Marcus came through the door, stamping the cold off his boots, and Diana was right behind him, and Nathan heard footsteps in the hall that sounded like Jessie's deliberate, even stride, and the day began. Victoria came back on a Thursday evening, which was not the plan. The plan had been Sunday. She'd said Sunday. He'd put it in his phone. He'd mentioned it casually to Lily in a way that he hoped sounded casual and which Lily had received with the focused attention of someone taking notes. But Victoria had texted him Thursday afternoon while he was driving home from the center with sawdust on his jeans and a cold coffee in the cup holder to say she'd caught an earlier flight, she was back, and was he around this weekend? He'd replied that he was, and she'd replied that she'd brought something from the lumberyard near the second center, a piece of figured walnut she'd seen in the window and finally gone in and bought, and he'd laughed in the truck alone because of course she had. He called his mother that evening. "Is it too soon to have her meet Lily?" he said. His mother was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking rather than stalling. "What does your gut say?" "My gut says Lily has been forming opinions for 3 weeks, and if I delay this any longer, she's going to start making things up to fill the information gap." "Then it's not too soon," his mother said. "Lily's been asking about her." "I know. She asked me whether Victoria was pretty," his mother said. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. "What did you say?" "I said I hadn't met her. She said that was unhelpful." A pause, warm with suppressed amusement. "She then asked if you thought she was pretty, and I told her that was a question for you." "Thank you for that," Nathan said. "I'm her grandmother," his mother said, "not her intelligence service." He arranged it for Saturday afternoon, which felt like enough structure without too much. Not a formal dinner, not an event. Victoria suggested the park near Nathan's apartment, which had a small playground and enough open space that a 7-year-old could self-regulate if the social pressure became too much. He appreciated that she'd thought about it from Lily's perspective, which was not nothing. Saturday was cold, but clear. The kind of December day that was honest about what it was rather than pretending it warmth. Lily wore her red coat and her boots with the stars on them, and had been, Nathan noticed, unusually quiet in the car on the way to the park, which in Lily's particular emotional vocabulary meant she was managing something significant. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You're quiet." "I'm thinking," she said. He did not ask what she was thinking about because he was fairly sure he knew, and also because she'd tell him if she wanted to. Victoria was already at the park when they arrived, standing near the entrance with her hands in the pockets of a dark coat, the piece of figured walnut apparently left at her car. She looked the way she always looked, not dressed up, not casual in a performed way, just herself. She saw them and walked over, and Nathan watched Lily watch her approach with the silent, total attention of a child conducting a very serious evaluation. "Hi," Victoria said to Lily, stopping a comfortable distance away, not crouching down in the way adults sometimes do with children, which can feel condescending, just standing. "I'm Victoria." "I know," Lily said. "I'm Lily." "I know," Victoria said. "Your dad talks about you." "He talks about you too," Lily said. Victoria glanced at Nathan with a micro-expression of amusement that he received without visibly reacting to. "Good things, I hope," she said to Lily. Lily considered this with the gravity of a federal judge. "He says you're honest," she said. "He says you don't perform things. That's—" Victoria seemed briefly genuinely caught off guard, which was rare. "That's a kind thing to say." "He also says you keep a horse made of pipe cleaners on your desk," Lily said. "I do," Victoria said. "My niece made it." "Is it a good horse?" "It's a very creative interpretation of a horse," Victoria said. Lily studied her for another moment, then apparently reached whatever internal threshold she'd set, because her posture changed, the held-in quality releasing. And she said, "There's a good climbing structure near the back. Do you want to see it?" "Yes," Victoria said. They walked and Nathan followed at a half-step behind, watching his daughter lead this woman through the park with the matter-of-fact authority of a local guide, showing someone around a city they've lived in their whole lives. Lily narrated as they went. That tree had a hole in it that a squirrel used to live in but didn't anymore. This path had a crack in it from when a truck drove over the curb last summer. The climbing structure had a platform you could see the whole park from if you stood on the right side. Victoria listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she brought to things at the center. Genuine, unrushed, not performing interest but actually having it. She asked questions at the right intervals, not leading questions, just real ones. What happened to the squirrel? How big was the truck? Which side of the platform? Nathan watched this happening and kept quiet. At the climbing structure, Lily went up and stood on the platform she'd described and pointed out the sight lines with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity to demonstrate something. Victoria stood at the base and looked where Lily pointed. "You can see the water tower," Lily said. "You can," Victoria agreed. Dad says the water tower has been there since before his mom was born, Lily said. Is that right? Victoria said to Nathan. That's what my mother told me, he said. I have no independent evidence. It looks old, Lily said, studying it with an expression of historical interest. Then, without transition, in the easy way children move between topics. Do you like the workshop? Very much, Victoria said. Dad's happier there, Lily said, not to either of them specifically, just as a statement of observed fact. Before he was doing okay, but okay isn't the same as happy. She came down from the platform, one step at a time, boots clanging on the metal. Pop's tools are there now. I think that helps. Nathan felt the thing that happened in his chest when Lily said something that was more accurate than he was prepared for. It happened regularly. He hadn't gotten used to it. I think so too, Victoria said quietly. Lily landed on the ground and looked up at Victoria with the directness she'd inherited from nobody, and developed entirely on her own. Are you going to keep coming to the workshop? I plan to, Victoria said. Are you going to keep having dinner with my dad? Lily, Nathan said. I'm asking, Lily said, unapologetically. Victoria looked at Nathan for a half second, then back at Lily. I'm planning on that too, she said. Lily processed this. Okay, she said. Then, do you want to see the crack from the truck? It's near the other path. Very much, Victoria said. They walked to the crack from the truck, which was a fairly ordinary crack in the pavement that Lily had assigned significant historical importance to, and Victoria looked at it with appropriate seriousness, and Nathan walked beside them in the cold December air and thought about the particular arithmetic of a life adding things up in directions you didn't plan for, and how the math, when it worked out, had a quality that was hard to name, and that he wasn't going to try to name out loud in a park on a Saturday afternoon, but that sat in him warm and specific as the weight of his grandfather's plane. The annual community exhibition at the Greystone Center was scheduled for the third Saturday of February. Sandra had been planning it since October, with the particular organized enthusiasm of someone who understood that these events served a purpose beyond celebration. They were proof, legible to family members and donors and the participants themselves, that something real had happened in these rooms over the preceding months. The exhibition was open to all departments of the center, not just the workshop, but the woodworking program had become, in Sandra's word, the anchor, which Nathan found simultaneously flattering and pressurizing. He'd had 6 weeks to think about what the exhibition meant, and he still wasn't sure he'd fully processed it. The participants had been thinking about it longer than he had. Marcus had raised it in early January. They were deep into a Tuesday session, the room at full capacity now, 14 participants across different stages of different projects, the noise level a comfortable working hum. And he'd said, while fitting a piece of trim to the second bookshelf he was building, this one for Keisha's friend whose own father was in the program. Are we bringing the stuff we've made to the exhibition? That's the idea, Nathan said. What happens to it after? You take it home, or donate it, or leave it here if you want. Your call. Marcus ran his hand along the trim. My first shelf is still in the corner, he said, which was true, which was something Nathan had decided not to address until Marcus addressed it. Yeah, Nathan said. I keep telling myself I'm going to bring it home. He looked at it. I like it being in this room. You can bring it to the exhibition and take it home from there, Nathan said. Or you can take it home before. Or you can put it in the exhibition and then bring it back here after. There's no rule. Marcus looked at him. What if I wanted to leave it here? Permanently? Nathan thought about that. I think we could find a place for it, he said. Like what do you call it? A reference piece. I was going to say a reminder, Nathan said. Marcus looked at the shelf for a long moment. Yeah, he said. That's better. The weeks running up to the exhibition took on a different quality than the regular sessions. Not more intense exactly, but more concentrated, like a focus had sharpened in the room without anyone formally announcing it. People were finishing things, not rushing, not cutting corners, but bringing things to their conclusions with a care that Nathan recognized as pride, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience to be genuine, but doesn't mind one either. Jesse's shelf had gone home to his daughter's room 3 weeks after her birthday, and he was now building a second piece, a small writing desk, the most ambitious project he'd attempted, that he said was for his wife, who worked from home and had been using the kitchen table for 2 years. The desk was giving him trouble in the way that ambitious projects do. Problems at every joint, the proportions requiring more math than the earlier pieces, and Jesse's relationship with difficulty had evolved enough that he was working through it rather than around it, which was not the same thing as not being frustrated by it, but was different from where he'd been in October. "The apron's not level," he told Nathan one Thursday, with the flat affect of someone who has already thought through the problem and is reporting it rather than panicking about it. Nathan looked at it. "Half a degree off on the right side. See where it's sitting?" "Yeah." Jesse crouched down to eye level with the joint. "I thought I measured it." "You did measure it. The measurement was right when you made it." Nathan ran his hand under the apron. "This board had a twist in it, barely visible when you dimensioned it. By the time you got to assembly, it expressed itself." "So it's not my fault," Jesse said, with a flat dryness that in October would have been absent. "It's never the wood's fault, and it's never entirely your fault," Nathan said. "It's a conversation. You measured, the board twisted anyway. Now you have the conversation about what to do next." Jesse stood back up. "Take the apron off, flatten the twist, refit." "Yep." "That's 3 hours of work." "Yep." Jesse looked at the desk. "She's been using the kitchen table for 2 years," he said. 3 more hours is not going to kill her." "Probably not," Nathan agreed. Jesse went back to work without further complaint, which 3 months ago would not have been the outcome. Corey came back to the center 2 weeks before the exhibition. He wasn't enrolled in the program anymore. He'd completed what he'd come for, or at least what he could complete in this particular room at this particular time, and he'd left in December with his table and a handshake and Diane's phone number because they'd somehow, in the way of people who've been in a difficult room together, become genuine friends. But he came back on a Tuesday morning and stood in the door of the workshop the way Nathan had stood in the door of his grandfather's workshop when he was 12, feeling the room before entering it. Nathan saw him and nodded once. Corey came in. "I have something for the exhibition," Corey said. He was carrying something under his arm, a wooden panel, about 18 inches square, wrapped in cloth. Nathan waited. Corey set it on the workbench and unwrapped it. It was a carved relief panel. Not furniture, not functional in any structural sense, just a piece of white oak with a scene carved into it. Shallow relief work that was more sophisticated than anything they'd done in the program. A tree, branches spreading, roots going down into something that was partly ground and partly suggestion. The carving was not perfect. There were tool marks visible that a more experienced carver would have cleaned. The bark texture was inconsistent in one corner, but it was real and it was his, and it had the quality of something that had been worked on with genuine attention over a long time. "You've been carving," Nathan said. "Since December," Corey said. "I watched some things online, bought a set of gouges." He looked at the panel. "I don't know if it's good enough for the exhibition." "It's good," Nathan said. "It's not finished." "What's left?" "I don't know," Corey said. He stood there looking at it with the expression of someone who has put something real into a thing and is now uncertain how to be in relation to it. "I don't know if it's ever going to feel finished." Nathan understood that in the way you understand something when you've felt a version of it yourself. He looked at the tree, the roots, the suggestion of ground, and something else below the ground. "You can show it as a work in progress," Nathan said. "That's a legitimate thing. Most things worth showing are." Corey looked at him sideways. "Is that what you do?" "I'd probably overthink it for 2 weeks and then show it," Nathan said. "So probably start with that and skip the 2 weeks." Corey almost smiled. Not quite, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that counted. "I'll be there," Corey said. He rewrapped the panel. "My sister's coming. She's been wanting to see what I've been up to." He paused. "She cried when she saw the table." "Yeah?" "She said she'd been worried about me for a long time," Corey said. "She said the table looked like I was back." He stopped. "I told her I wasn't all the way back. She said she knew that. She said back enough was enough for right now." Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. "Your sister's right," he said. "Yeah," Corey said. "She usually is." He picked up the panel. "I'll see you on the day." The night before the exhibition, Nathan couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark at 11:30 and stared at the ceiling and went through the logistics the way anxious people go through logistics at 11:30. The tables that Sandra had arranged, the layout of the pieces, the schedule, the parking, the things that could go wrong and how to handle them. Until he recognized what he was doing and stopped, because the logistics were fine, and Sandra had been organizing events at that center for 9 years, and the logistics were never what was actually keeping him awake. What was keeping him awake was something harder to name. He sat up, went to the kitchen, put the kettle on. He stood at the window while the water heated and looked at the dark street and the orange cast of the streetlights on the pavement. And he thought about the morning he'd loaded that cardboard box into the passenger seat of his truck. He thought about the man who had done that. Not a bad version of himself, not a broken version, but a tired one. A version who had been moving through his life in the survival register for long enough that he'd stopped noticing there was another register available. He thought about what his mother had said. You've been doing the survival version of your life for a while. The kettle clicked off. He poured the water over a tea bag and let it sit. He thought about Marcus's hands flat on the workbench, about Jesse's drawer, fitted clean, about Diane's left hand moving with steadiness it had taken weeks to build, about Corey's carved tree and its relief panel, roots going down into uncertain ground, about Ray and Juanita arguing their way to something they were proud of, about Kazia's crooked box and her immediate plan to make another one. He thought about all of it, and he thought about what it had cost him, not in a self-pitying way, just accurately, to drive 2.5 hours with a cardboard box and knock on a door he hadn't known was important. He took his tea to the couch and sat with it and thought, I am not the same person who drove that truck. Not in a dramatic sense. He still had the dent in the back panel. He still picked Lily up from school in it every day. He still made her lunches that were sometimes uninspired and helped her with math, that was sometimes at the edge of what he could remember and lost his keys at least twice a week. But inside the ordinary structure of his days, something had reorganized. Some load-bearing wall had shifted, and the room that resulted was larger and better lit than the one before it. He went back to bed at 1 a.m. and slept, finally, with the specific quality of sleep that comes when you've set something down. The exhibition day was a Saturday in February that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be winter or the first suggestion of something else. Cold in the morning, then pale and tentative sunlight by midday that didn't warm anything but was better than nothing. The parking lot was more full than Nathan had ever seen it. Sandra had organized the main hall into a series of stations, each participant's work displayed on a table with a small card that gave the piece's name and the maker's name and a single line about the work, if the maker had chosen to provide one. Nathan arrived 2 hours before the event started and spent the time not pacing because he'd told himself he wasn't going to pace, and therefore pacing in a somewhat interrupted way while helping arrange tables that Sandra had already arranged perfectly. Nathan, Sandra said, gently but firmly, the tables are fine. I know, he said. Sorry. Go look at the pieces, she said. He walked through the room. Marcus's first bookshelf was there. The reference piece sitting at the end of the row with a card that said, First Piece, for Kazia's books. No other explanation. It didn't need one. Jesse's writing desk was there, and Nathan stopped in front of it for a long moment. The desk was the best thing Jesse had made and probably the best thing to come out of the program yet in terms of pure craft. The proportions worked, the joinery was clean, the drawer worked silently on its runners. The apron that had been 3 hours of extra work was level. The surface was finished in a way that showed the wood's character without masking it. The card said, For Sarah. For the kitchen table she shouldn't have had to use. Nathan looked at that card for longer than he meant to. Diane's cutting board was not there. She'd given it to her mother weeks ago, and her mother had, by all accounts, used it immediately. But her end table was a clean, well-made piece in white oak with a small shelf at the bottom. The card reading, My left hand's idea. Corey's relief panel was in the center of the last table, the cloth removed, the carved tree visible with its spreading branches and uncertain roots. The card next to it said, In progress. 2 words, which was exactly right. Ray and Juanita's bench was too large for a table, so it sat on the floor near the entrance where people would see it first, which was where Sandra had put it on purposes. The card said, for the front porch, built with significant disagreement and mutual respect. Nathan stood in the middle of the room and looked at all of it. He stood there long enough that Sandra found him and stood beside him and also looked at it. "Well," she said after a moment. "Yeah," he said. "When I wrote the report for the board," she said, "I included the outcome metrics. Participation rates, session completion, self-reported well-being scores, re-engagement with family indicators." She paused. The board was impressed by the numbers. "But," Nathan said. "But the numbers don't include Marcus's hands on the workbench," she said. "They don't include Jesse's 3 extra hours. They don't include Corey coming back with a carved tree he didn't know was finished." She looked at the room. "The numbers are real, but they're not the whole thing." "No," Nathan said. "They're not." Victoria arrived with the families. She came in with the general flow of people entering the hall, not ahead of them or apart from them. She was not the kind of person who made an entrance, which was one of the specific things about her that Nathan had stopped being surprised by and started simply appreciating. She was wearing the dark coat, and she had her hair down, which he noticed because she usually kept it up, and she saw him across the room and raised her hand in a small, direct wave that was not a performance. He crossed the room to her. "The desk," she said immediately. "I know. Jesse made that." He did. "In 4 months," she said. Not disbelief, emphasis. 3, if you count from when he started working seriously. The first month was mostly learning to not rush the saw. She was looking around the room with the expression he'd learned to read as her processing things. Not performing appreciation, genuinely taking it in and letting it mean what it meant. He watched her stop at Corey's panel, read the card, look at the carving for a long moment. "In progress," she said. "Yeah." "I like that," she said. "It's honest." They stood near each other at the edge of the room as the hall filled. Family members arriving, some of them tentative, the way people are tentative when they've been worried about someone for a long time, and are being asked to see evidence that things have changed, some of them loud with the relief of it. He watched Jesse's wife, Sarah, walk directly to the writing desk, read the card, put both hands over her mouth. Jesse was next to her, and he was watching her face and not saying anything, and his face was doing things that Nathan looked away from, because some moments ask for their privacy even in a crowded room. Marcus's daughter, Kazia, was there in a coat with a small embroidered flower on the collar that she'd clearly chosen herself, and she went immediately to the bookshelf, the first one, and ran her hand along the top the way she had in the workshop months ago. Then she looked up at her father. "This one's yours," she said. Not a question, a claim. "That one's yours," Marcus said. "I made it for you." "But it says reference piece on the card," Kazia said. "It's a reference piece in this room," Marcus said. "It comes home with us today." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said, "but you have to build me another one." "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." Ray and Juanita's bench had drawn a small crowd near the entrance, people sitting on it the way people sit on benches when they encounter one unexpectedly, just to test it, to see if it was real. It held the weight easily, which it would, because Ray had been meticulous about the joinery, and Juanita had been equally meticulous about the finish, and what they had argued their way into was a bench that would outlast all of them. "It's a good bench," Victoria said beside him. "It really is," Nathan said. "Are they always like that?" she said, meaning Ray and Juanita. "Every single session," Nathan said. "It's like watching two people fight about a crossword puzzle that they're both right about." "That's a gift," Victoria said. "Some people spend a lifetime looking for someone to disagree with that much." He looked at her sideways. She was watching the room with the particular stillness she had when something was landing in her correctly. The midday sun was coming through the high windows now, lower than the workshop's windows, and at a different angle, throwing a different quality of light across the pieces. And the room was full of people and conversation and the specific noise of a gathering where the reason to gather is a good one. "I want to tell you something," Nathan said. She turned to look at him. 6 months ago I was doing okay," he said. I'm not setting up a dramatic contrast. I was genuinely okay. I had Lily and the job and a life that worked in a functional way. But I was okay the way a house is okay when you've fixed everything that was broken and you've stopped asking whether it could be something more than not broken. She was quiet, listening. I drove 2.5 hours with a box, he said, and you asked me one question. And I don't know what you saw when you saw me that day, but whatever you thought was in there. He stopped. You were right about it, and I don't know what the protocol is for saying thank you for that. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. There was something on her face that he'd seen before. The expression that appeared when something cost her something to feel. Real emotion moving through a person who was usually careful with real emotion. You did the work, she said. You drove the 2.5 hours. You sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before you got out of the truck. You know about the 10 minutes? Sandra's office has a window to the parking lot, she said without apology. You drove here. You went in. You showed up every week. You brought your grandfather's tools out of storage. You did all of that. She paused. I asked a question. You answered it. Everything else was you. Not everything, he said. She looked at him. Not the part with the iced tea, he said. She made the sound that was almost a laugh, and then it became an actual laugh, quiet and real, in the noisy room. Across the hall, Sandra was calling the room to attention. A few words of welcome, brief and warm, the kind of speech that earned its welcome length. Nathan half listened and watched the room simultaneously. Corey in the far corner with a woman who had to be his sister, both of them standing in front of the carved panel, the sister's hand on Corey's arm. Jessie and Sarah at the writing desk. Sarah with her fingers on the surface of it like she was reading something written in the grain. Kezia back at Marcus's bookshelf, opening and closing the small cabinet door at the bottom with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who knows this object is hers. Nathan's grandfather had built a rocking chair when Nathan was 12 that had sat in the front room of the house for the remaining decades of his grandfather's life, and was now, Nathan knew, in his mother's living room where it had been since the funeral, still doing what a rocking chair does, which is hold whatever weight is placed in it. His grandfather had not said, while building the chair, that it was going to mean something. He just built it the way he built everything, with patience and attention and the understanding that the process was worth doing right, regardless of what the product turned out to be. The product had turned out to be something that lasted. That was usually how it went, his grandfather had said, when Nathan was maybe 15 and finally old enough to understand the observation. You don't build for meaning, you build right, and the meaning shows up on its own. Nathan stood in the exhibition hall and watched the meaning show up. Sandra finished her remarks. Someone started a small round of applause that expanded into a genuine one. Kezia clapped with both hands held high, the way children clap when they're enthusiastic and have not yet learned to moderate it for an adult room. Nathan felt Victoria's hand find his and stay there, not a gesture, just a presence. Her hand in his hand in a crowded room full of people holding things they'd built. He didn't look at her. He just let it be what it was. After a while, he said quietly, Lily wants to come next time. To the center? Victoria said. To make something. She says she watched Kezia's box come out crooked and she's pretty sure she can do better. She probably can, Victoria said. She definitely can, Nathan said. She's been watching me for 4 months. She absorbs things without telling you she's absorbing them. She got that from someone, Victoria said. He looked at her. She was watching the room, not him, but the corner of her mouth had that particular quality that meant she knew he was looking. He thought about a version of himself 6 months ago, doing the survival version of his life. He thought about a cardboard box in a passenger seat. He thought about a question asked over iced tea in a kitchen that smelled like fresh basil and the coming rain. He thought about how close he'd come to saying no to the iced tea. He thought about that for exactly 1 second and then let it go, because the room was full and warm, and the pieces that had been built by people who had not believed they could build them were on their tables in the midday light, and the life he was standing in was not the survival version. It was something else. 3 weeks after the exhibition, Nathan got a text from Elena. It arrived on a Tuesday morning while he was in the center parking lot finishing his coffee before the session, and he saw her name on the screen and felt nothing dramatic. A small recognition, the way you recognize a street you used to live on when you drive past it years later. Familiar in a way that no longer had urgency attached to it. The text said, I heard the program is going really well. Sandra mentioned it to a mutual friend. I'm glad, Nathan. I really am. I hope you're doing okay. He sat with it for a moment, turned his coffee cup in his hand, looked at the bare oak trees at the edge of the property, which were beginning, barely, tentatively, to show the first suggestion of buds. February had loosened into something that wasn't quite March yet, but was pointed in that direction. He typed back, "Thank you. I am. I hope you are too." He meant both sentences, which was the thing about clean endings that people didn't tell you. They were only clean in retrospect, from enough distance, and the distance itself took time to build. He'd been building it for 8 months without fully knowing that was what he was doing. He put his phone in his pocket and went inside. He thought about the box, not with pain, just as a fact, the way you think about a starting point when you can see how far you've moved from it. He'd driven 2.5 hours to return 5 pounds of photographs and a bracelet and a letter he'd never reread, and the act of returning them had freed something in him that he hadn't known was held until it wasn't anymore. He thought about what his grandfather used to say about joints. The connection is only as strong as what's on both sides of it. Weak wood on either end, and it doesn't matter how well you cut the joint. He'd spent 5 years in something where both sides had been trying, genuinely trying, but where the wood on both ends had not been the right wood for each other, and no amount of well-cut joinery could fix that particular problem. The kindest thing that had happened was that they'd both finally acknowledged it before the structure failed more dramatically. He'd been so focused on the loss that he'd missed for too long the fact that the loss had also been a release. Inside the workshop, Jesse was already there. This was new. Jesse had moved from early to early in the past month, which Sandra said was a pattern she recognized in participants who were working through something outside the center by coming into the center. Nathan had noticed it and left it alone, because some processes need room, and Jesse would tell him if he wanted to be told. But today, Jesse was not at his workbench. He was standing near the window looking out at the property, and when Nathan came in, he turned with an expression that Nathan had not seen on him before. Not distress, not the controlled quiet that had been his baseline in October. Something more complicated and more open than both. "You have a minute?" Jesse said. "Yeah," Nathan said. They sat on 2 stools near the front bench, the workshop empty around them, tools hanging in their places, the low morning light coming through the high windows at the angle it came through in late February. "I went back to work," Jesse said. "Part-time, starting next month." Nathan waited. Logistics coordinator, different outfit than before, closer to home. Jesse looked at his hands on his knees. "My wife cried when I told her, good crying. The kind where you've been holding something for so long that when it's over, your body doesn't know what to do with the space." "How do you feel about it?" Nathan said. "Scared," Jesse said directly. No qualifier, just the word. "I'm scared I'm not ready. I'm scared I'm more ready than I think, and the work itself won't be enough anymore, which is a different kind of scared." He paused. "I'm scared that I'll be good at it again, and then something will happen, and I'll be back at zero." "That last one's the real one," Nathan said. Jesse looked at him. "Yeah." "You're scared that you'll invest in a version of yourself that can be broken again," Nathan said. "Because you know now that it can be broken. You didn't know that before." "I knew it," Jesse said. "I just didn't think it would happen to me." Nathan nodded. He understood that with a specificity that had nothing to do with anything as dramatic as what Jesse had been through, just the ordinary human conviction that the difficult things were for other people, right up until they weren't. "The desk is in my wife's office now," Jesse said. "Is she using it?" "Every day. She sent me a picture of her laptop on it the first morning." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "She said it changed the room, that it makes the room feel like something happened in it on purpose." Nathan thought about that, like something happened in it on purpose. He filed that sentence in the place where he kept the things that people said in the workshop that were more accurate than they knew. "You're ready enough," Nathan said. "Not all the way ready. I don't know if all the way ready comes back the same way it was, but you're ready enough for the next thing, and the next thing will tell you what comes after it." Jesse was quiet for a while, looking at the tools on the pegboard. "I was thinking," he said, "that maybe I'd keep coming in, even after. Not as a Not because I need it the same way, just because I like it in here. You don't need a reason, Nathan said. The Tuesday session conflicts with the new job, Jesse said, but Thursday still works. Thursday still works, Nathan said. Jesse nodded once, and the expression on his face settled into something Nathan didn't have a precise word for. Not peace exactly, not relief, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as both. Readiness, maybe. The specific readiness of someone who has done the internal work and is now turning toward the external world with the knowledge that they are not the same person who turned away from it. The session filled in around them over the next 20 minutes, the familiar sounds of people arriving and settling in, the low conversation that happened in the first few minutes before the work absorbed everyone's attention. Nathan moved through the room the way he had every Tuesday and Thursday for 7 months, stopping where he was needed, listening more than talking, watching hands. Diane's end table had gone home last week, and she was starting something new, a small cabinet with a glass panel door, the most technically demanding thing she'd attempted, and she'd researched it, which he knew because she'd arrived that morning with a sketch and 3 questions written on an index card in her precise, practical handwriting. The right hand that had been stiff and guarded in October was not fixed. There were still things she couldn't do without modification, and probably always would be. But the left hand had developed a confidence and a literacy with tools that was genuinely impressive, and she'd stopped apologizing for the modification of technique that her injury required, which had taken longer than the technique itself. "The piano hinge or the knife hinge?" she asked him, the index card in her left hand. "For that door knife hinge," Nathan said. "Piano hinge is heavier than that panel needs. You'll have trouble with the alignment long term." "That's what I thought," she said, making a note on the card. "I just wanted to check." "You don't always need to check," Nathan said. She looked up from the card. "I mean it," he said. "You know the answer before you ask. You've known it for about a month. You're checking because you're not sure you trust the knowing yet." Diane held his gaze for a moment. "That's a little direct," she said. "Yeah," he said. "You can tell me to mind my own business." "No," she said after a pause. "You're right." She looked at the index card. "It's hard to trust it when it used to be wrong so often." "It wasn't wrong," Nathan said. "It was inexperienced. There's a difference. Wrong means the compass is broken. Inexperienced just means you haven't been to enough places to read it yet." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. Then she put the card in her pocket and picked up the knife hinge she'd already bought, because she'd already known the answer, and got to work. Marcus brought Kezia back in March. She came in on a Saturday. Nathan had started a Saturday morning session open to family members of participants, which had been Victoria's idea, and which he'd initially resisted because he wasn't sure how to manage a workshop that contained both people in recovery and enthusiastic 9-year-olds, and which he'd conceded after Victoria pointed out that the distinction between those two populations was not as large as he was treating it. She'd been right. The Saturday sessions had a different energy than the weekday ones, like looser, more noise, more laughter, more people asking basic questions without apology, because the Saturday population was unfiltered by the specific self-consciousness of people who felt they should already know things. It was good for the weekday participants who came on Saturdays, too. Nathan had watched Marcus explain a concept to a first-timer with the patience and specificity of someone who had been on the receiving end of good instruction and knew what it felt like. Kezia came in with a purpose that was visible from the doorway. She'd been practicing at home, she told Nathan immediately, by way of explaining something. She'd watched videos, she'd bought sandpaper with her own money, she'd practiced sanding the edges of scrap wood she'd found in the garage. "I sanded a piece of baseboard," she told him. "Why a baseboard?" "It was the only scrap piece I could find that Dad would let me have," she said. He said the rest was for a project. Marcus, behind her, raised his hands in a gesture of mild innocence. "What are you making today?" Nathan asked her. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and opened it. It was a drawing, a small box with a lid, the lid hinged, with dimensions written in the corners in the careful handwriting of a 9-year-old who had thought about this. The dimensions were roughly right, which meant she'd thought about it with some mathematical attention rather than just decoratively. "A jewelry box," she said, "for my mom, for her birthday." Nathan looked at the drawing. "This is a good drawing." I know, she said, without false modesty. Can we make it? We can work toward it, Nathan said. The hinge is going to take some figuring. I know, she said. I looked it up. He spent the Saturday morning with Keziah at the bench, and Marcus worked nearby on his second project, a set of small stools for Keziah's room, which she had apparently specified in some detail, and the workshop held that Saturday quality of a room where the difficulty of the work and the pleasure of it were in an easy balance. Keziah had her father's seriousness about getting things right and her own particular stubbornness about not asking for help until she'd tried something at least twice herself, which was occasionally frustrating to watch, and ultimately a quality that would serve her very well. The corner's not square, Nathan said when she brought him the first assembled box side. She looked at it. I measured it. Measure again. She measured again. Her face went through a small private sequence of expressions. It's a degree off, she said. Half a degree, Nathan said. But you're right that it's off. How do I fix it? You recut the piece, he said, or you make the adjustment at the corner itself during assembly. Which one you choose depends on whether you want the correction to be invisible or not. Invisible, she said immediately. Then you recut, he said. She looked at the piece, then at the saw, then at the piece again. That's a lot of work, she said. Yeah, he said. She took the piece back to the bench and recut it without further comment. The second cut was right. When she brought it back, Nathan didn't say anything about the correction, just nodded once, and she took that nod with the satisfaction of someone who knew exactly what it meant. By the end of the session, the box was partially assembled and the hinge problem had been identified and set aside for next time. Keziah stood back and looked at what existed so far. 4 walls, a base, no lid yet, and did the head tilt that Nathan had come to recognize in the workshop as the posture of someone genuinely evaluating their own work rather than performing evaluation. It's going to be good, she said. Yeah, Nathan said. It is. Next Saturday? Next Saturday, he said. On the drive home that afternoon, Nathan thought about Keziah's drawing, the careful dimensions, the thought she'd put into it before she'd ever touched a piece of wood. He thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with a plan that you'd actually made, as opposed to a plan you were pretending to have. He'd been thinking about a different kind of plan for a while now, not in an anxious way, not the 11:30 ceiling kind of thinking, but the kind that builds in the background of a life while the life is going on, slow and steady and gaining density the way a joint gains strength as the glue cures, quietly and without drama, until one day it's holding weight and you realize it has been for some time. He and Victoria had been together in the actual named sense. The conversation having happened in December over takeout containers on his kitchen floor because Lily had commandeered the couch for a fort for 4 months. They had not rushed anything, which was the result of both of them having the specific caution of people who had been somewhere that ended and didn't want to move quickly through something good in order to arrive at a definition. They'd let it be what it was while it was being it, which was the relationship advice his grandfather had once given his grandmother when she asked how they'd lasted, and which Nathan's mother had told him about years later, like handing him something useful for the road. The practical realities of their lives were not simple. Victoria traveled and, not constantly, but regularly, the nature of running a multi-location foundation that was in active expansion. Nathan's schedule was built around Lily in a way that could flex but had real limits. They lived 40 minutes apart, which was close enough to be manageable and far enough to require intention. None of this was insurmountable. All of it required the ongoing, unglamorous work of 2 people choosing to make something work, rather than waiting for it to become convenient. They were both, it turned out, willing to do that work. Victoria had met Lily 3 more times since the park. They had a rapport that Nathan watched with the particular attention of a father who understands that this observation is among the most important he will ever conduct. Lily did not perform around Victoria. She didn't try to be impressive or particularly charming, which was what she did around adults she was uncertain of. She was just Lily around Victoria, direct, occasionally unsettling in her accuracy, full of opinions and the willingness to express them. Victoria received all of it without flinching, without condescension, without the performance of loving it. She was just present, which was what Lily needed and what Lily, Nathan suspected, had been quietly evaluating all along. The evening after the Saturday session with Kezia, Nathan drove to Victoria's. He'd been doing this more, driving the 40 minutes on weekend evenings when Lily was at his mother's or at a sleepover, and it still had the quality, each time, of something he was choosing rather than something he'd gotten used to, which he thought was probably healthy. He brought a bottle of wine he'd picked out with more thought than he'd admit to, and a small piece of figured maple he'd been working on during the week. A thin panel, nothing functional, just an exercise in understanding how the figure moved when you worked it at different angles. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd heard the truck, and Stoic was visible in the hallway behind her, sitting on the floor with the massive indifference of a creature who had upgraded Nathan from irrelevant to tolerable over the past 4 months, which Victoria had told him was an extraordinary social achievement for which he should feel proud. They had dinner at her kitchen table, which was a different table from the one in the colonial house in Millhaven, where none of this had started. This was her own place, a converted farmhouse 20 minutes outside the city that had a library she'd clearly curated over years, and a kitchen with a view of a back field that in summer would be something and in late February was bare and honest and fine. They talked the way they always talked, about the program, about Kezia's jewelry box, about a conversation Victoria had had with the foundation board about a third location, about Jesse going back to work, about a book she'd been reading that she wanted him to read also. At some point in the evening, when the food was done and the wine was half gone, and Stoic had positioned himself on the chair between them in the way he did when he was feeling magnanimous, Victoria said something that had the quality of something she'd been moving toward for a while. "The board meeting in April is in Portland," she said. "Okay," he said. "I'd like you to come," she said. "Not to the board meeting, to Portland. I'll be there for 4 days. I thought if you could get your mother to take Lily for a long weekend." She paused. "I want to show you the city. I spent a year there in my late 20s. There's a lumber yard there that's the best I've ever been in, and I want to watch your face when you see it." He looked at her across the table. "You want to take me to a lumber yard," he said. "Among other things," she said. "But yes, specifically yes." He thought about his mother, who would say yes before he finished asking. He thought about Lily, who would have opinions about the logistics and who would want a souvenir and who would tell him when he came home that she'd been fine and to stop looking at her like that, Dad. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." "Yeah, okay," she said. Or, "Yeah, let me think about it." "Yeah, okay," he said. "Portland." She nodded and picked up her wine glass and looked at him with the expression that was not quite a smile, but was all the warmth of one. Stoic shifted on his chair between them, redistributing his weight with the massive dignity of a creature for whom all decisions were already made and found acceptable. In April, after Portland, which involved the lumber yard, which was everything Victoria had promised, and which produced in Nathan an almost embarrassing degree of enthusiasm that she watched with undisguised pleasure, Nathan built something for the first time in a decade that was purely for himself. He built it on evenings and on Saturday mornings after the session, in the workshop after everyone had gone, using his grandfather's tools and a piece of the figured walnut Victoria had bought from the lumberyard window months ago and brought home wrapped in brown paper in the back of her car. He didn't tell anyone what it was while he was making it. Sandra noticed he was staying late on Tuesdays but didn't ask, which was one of the things Nathan most appreciated about Sandra. It took 6 weeks. It was a small writing box, a lap desk, the old-fashioned kind, with a slanted surface that lifted to reveal a storage compartment inside. The whole thing in figured walnut with small brass fittings at the corners. The figure in the walnut was remarkable. The kind of wood that does things with light that you can't entirely plan for and can only work with. And Nathan had worked with it the way his grandfather had taught him to work with exceptional material, slowly, with attention, without trying to dominate it. He finished it on a Tuesday evening in May, standing alone in the workshop with the last of the afternoon light through the high windows, and he ran his hands over the surface and found nothing that needed changing. He sat down on the stool. He thought, Pop would have liked this piece, not as an obituary, just as a fact, the kind you can hold without grief once enough time has passed and enough living has been done on the other side of the loss. His grandfather would have picked it up, turned it, held it to the light to see the figure in the walnut, and he would have made a sound of genuine appreciation that was not a word. And then he probably would have had a note about the corner fitting that needed the left one adjusted by a hair, and he would have been right, and Nathan would have made the adjustment, and they would have moved on. He brought the writing box to Victoria the following Saturday. He'd told her he had something for her, which was all he'd said, and she'd looked at him with the measured curiosity that was her characteristic response to things she couldn't yet categorize. He carried it in from the truck wrapped in the oilcloth from his grandfather's chest, the same oilcloth that had kept the planes and chisels for 20 years, and he set it on her kitchen table and unwrapped it. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the walnut, the way the figure moved in the grain, the brass corner fittings, the way the lid lifted, and the compartment inside was fitted with a small cedar panel that perfumed the air when it opened. "Nathan," she said. "It's for writing," he said. "You write letters. I've seen you. I thought—" "I write letters on my laptop," she said. "I know," he said. "But you write actual letters too. You keep stamps in your desk drawer." She looked at him. "You noticed my stamps?" "I notice things," he said, which was her phrase and she knew it, and the corner of her mouth moved accordingly. She put her hands on the box, both of them, flat on the surface, the way he'd seen so many hands go flat on wood in moments that mattered, and stayed like that for a moment. "The walnut," she said. "This is from the piece you brought from the lumberyard window," he said. "Yeah." She was quiet again. "It took 6 weeks," he said. "The figure gives you trouble if you rush it. You have to work with where it wants to go." She looked up at him. There was something in her eyes that she wasn't trying to manage, which on Victoria was significant. "You made this for me," she said, as if still processing the fact of it. "Yeah," he said. "In your grandfather's tools." "Yeah." She stood there for another moment, both hands still on the wood, and Nathan watched her be moved by something without apology or performance, just the real thing moving through a real person, and he thought that this was one of the things he'd learned in 7 months of watching people in a workshop. That the moments when someone stops managing themselves and just feels the thing are the moments when you see who they actually are and who Victoria actually was, stripped of the foundation and the board meetings and the 40-minute drive and the careful negotiation of 2 adult lives trying to fit together without forcing who she actually was someone who put both hands on a piece of walnut and let it matter. He had been paying attention for 7 months. What he saw was worth everything the attention had cost him. Lily was 8 in June. Her birthday party was 12 7-year-olds and 1 8-year-old in a backyard that Nathan and his mother had spent a Thursday evening stringing with lights, and a cake that Lily had specified in detail, and which Nathan had executed with moderate success, except for the lettering, which was a little crowded on one side. Victoria came. She arrived with a gift that Lily unwrapped with the focused deliberation of someone who has learned that good things deserve their unwrapping. It was a set of proper woodworking tools, child-sized but real, good quality, in a roll of canvas with each tool in its own sleeve, and Lily had looked at them, and then at Nathan, and then at Victoria with the expression of someone who has been understood. "For the Saturday sessions," Victoria said. "I know what they're for," Lily said, which was not rude. It was just accurate, in the way Lily was accurate, and she rolled the canvas back up and held it in both arms and went back to her party. Nathan stood next to Victoria in the backyard, watching 12 children run in various directions, and his mother was at the picnic table cutting cake with the efficiency of a woman who has cut a great many birthday cakes, and the lights his mother had helped him string were unnecessary in the June afternoon, but would matter once the sun went down. "She's going to be better at this than me within a year," Nathan said. 18 months, Victoria said. "She'll be polite about it." "She won't," he said, "but she'll mean well." Victoria laughed, the real one, full. And he felt it the way he'd felt it every time since the first time in the restaurant, like something good and specific that he hadn't expected to have and would not take for granted. His mother caught his eye from across the yard and raised an eyebrow in the particular way that meant she was registering something and filing it and would have opinions later. He gave her a look that said he was aware of this. She smiled and went back to the cake. In September, a year and a month after Nathan had driven to Millhaven with a cardboard box, he formalized the expanded program at all 3 Langford Foundation centers, He stood in Sandra's office and signed the paperwork, and Sandra shook his hand again with both of hers, which was what Sandra did with things that mattered, and then she showed him the outcomes report she'd prepared for the board. 12 months of data, participation rates, completion rates, self-reported measures, reemployment figures, family reunification indicators. The numbers were good in the way that numbers are good when the thing they're measuring is genuinely working. "You should take this home and read it," Sandra said. "I will," he said. "You should actually read it," she said, "not just look at the first page." "Sandra," he said. "I know you," she said. "Read the whole thing." He drove home with the report in the passenger seat, which was a different thing from what had sat in that seat a year ago, and he thought about the specific accounting of a year. All the things it had contained, all the things it had changed, all the versions of himself that had existed within it. He thought about his grandfather's note, penciled inside the lid of the tool chest, for what comes next. He'd thought about that note his whole life, and he was only now, at 32, or 33 in 3 weeks, beginning to understand it as permission rather than instruction, not a directive about what to do. An acknowledgement that whatever came next was worth the tools, worth the attention, worth showing up for. That evening, he went to the workshop alone. He didn't have a project. He just went, the way he'd started going on occasional evenings when what he needed was the room rather than any particular task. The quality of the light through the high windows at dusk, the smell of the wood and the linseed oil, the silence that was not empty but full of the residue of everything that had happened there. He sat on the stool that had become his stool by default and habit and looked at the room. Marcus's reference bookshelf was gone, taken home in June, finally, to Keziah's room, replaced by a photograph that Keziah had taken of it in her room, surrounded by the blue-covered books she'd told her father about in the first week of the program. The photograph was taped to the wall where the shelf had stood, which was Sandra's idea and the right idea. Jesse's bench was empty, clean, waiting for whoever came next. Jesse came in on Thursdays still. He was 8 months back at work and had told Nathan last week, without prologue, that he thought he was going to be okay. Not sure, but reasonably confident. Nathan had said that reasonably confident was a fine place to operate from, and Jesse had agreed and they'd gone back to work. Diane's current project, a blanket chest, the most technically ambitious thing she'd attempted, was covered in a drop cloth on the far bench, waiting for Thursday. She told Nathan last week that her right hand had improved by about 15% since October, which she'd said in the tone of someone reporting a useful data point, not a miracle, which was accurate. Corey had enrolled in a beginner's woodcarving class at the community college in January. He'd sent Nathan a photograph of a piece he'd made in the class, a carved spoon, smooth and well-proportioned, nothing like a birdhouse, nothing like a side table, a completely different direction that made complete sense when you understood that Corey was someone who always moved toward what came next and away from what he'd already learned. Ray and Juanita's bench was on their front porch. He knew this because they'd sent him a picture in March. The bench in the snow, impeccable, covered in about 4 inches of snow that it was bearing without complaint, which Ray had captioned, "Built to last." Nathan sat in the quiet of the workshop and thought about all the things that last. Not everything, and not in the way you expect, and usually not in the form you think you're building them in. You build a shelf, and you build someone's belief that their hands know things. You build a table, and you build 3 months of trust between a man and his wife who'd been waiting for him to come back. You build a writing box, and you build... He wasn't sure yet exactly what the writing box was building, something ongoing. Something that was still in process, the way good things usually are. He was still sitting there when Victoria texted. "You're at the center, aren't you?" He smiled at his phone. "Yeah. Lily is at your mom's. She's fine. She taught your mother a card game, and your mother is losing on purpose. She knows when people lose on purpose." "I know. That's why she likes it." A pause, then, "I'm outside." He put the phone in his pocket and went to the door of the workshop and down the hall and out the front entrance into the September evening, which was cool and smelled like the end of summer. That particular smell that is not quite fall yet, but has lost the thickness of August, light and clear, and faintly sad in the way that endings of seasons are sad, not because they're bad, but because they're real. Victoria was sitting on one of the wooden benches outside the entrance. The benches he'd noticed on his first day, the ones that had been built with care rather than purchased from a catalog. She had her coat on and her hands in her pockets, and she was looking at the property, at the oak trees and the dormant garden, and the sky that was going from blue to a faded particular gold. She looked up when he came out. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. "You were 40 minutes from the neighborhood," he said. "I drove," she said. He sat down beside her on the bench. It held them both the way it had been built to hold people, without drama, without show, just solid and quiet and there. They sat for a while without talking, which was something they'd gotten good at, or which they'd both always been good at independently, and had discovered they were good at together. The gold in the sky deepened, and the oak trees settled into it, and somewhere behind the center a bird was doing something repetitive and unconcerned. "I've been thinking," Victoria said after a while. "About what?" "About the Millhaven house," she said. "My friend sold it in July. Elena is in her own place now, has been since spring. The house is someone else's." She paused. "I keep thinking about that kitchen table, where we sat." "The iced tea," Nathan said. "The iced tea," she said. "I keep thinking about how close it was. You almost said no." "I almost said no," he said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it. Not the packaged version, just the real one, what had actually happened in the moment before he'd said yes to a glass of iced tea from a stranger in someone else's kitchen. "You asked without any agenda in it," he said. "It just sounded like a question." She was quiet for a moment. "I had some agenda," she said. I told you that." "I know," he said, "but it didn't sound like it. It sounded like you actually wanted to know." "I did," she said. "I do." He looked at her profile against the gold sky. The woman who ran a foundation and had board meetings in Chicago and kept stamps in her desk drawer and a pipe cleaner horse that didn't look like a horse, and who had driven 40 minutes on a September evening because she was thinking about a kitchen table. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm not scared anymore," he said. "Of this. Of what this is." He'd told Derek early on, 17 reasons to be careful, different worlds, the gap between their lives. "I was for a while. I was watching for the thing that would make it fall apart. The catch." "There's usually a catch," she said, which was honest and which he appreciated. "I know," he said, "but I've been watching for 8 months, and the thing I keep finding instead of a catch is—" He stopped. "You, just you. The same person at the board meeting and in the workshop and at Lily's birthday party and sitting on this bench." He paused. "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it's not." She turned to look at him, and he looked at her, and the things that were said and the things that weren't said occupied the space between them in the way they did between people who have learned each other well enough to know the difference between silence that needs filling and silence that is the fullness itself. He thought about a cardboard box. He thought about a door he hadn't known would open. He thought about the question that had pulled something up from where he'd buried it. What made you happiest before life got complicated? And he thought about what he would say to that question now if she asked it again. He thought he'd say, this. This is what makes me happy. The workshop and the tools and the way Lily holds a piece of wood up to the light to see the grain. The way Kezia measures twice and cuts once. The way Jessie's desk exists in a room where Sarah does her work and doesn't have to use the kitchen table. The way Corey's carved tree is rooted in ground that is not certain but is holding. He thought he'd say, you, the 40-minute drive you make because you were thinking about a kitchen table. The way you put both hands on the walnut. The stamps in the desk drawer. The way you asked a question without agenda and meant it. He thought he'd say, the life on the other side of the cardboard box. The one I didn't know was there. But she wasn't asking the question. She was just sitting beside him on a bench that had been built with care, in the gold September light, and he was beside her, and the oak trees were settling into the evening, and the bird behind the building had moved on to somewhere else, and the day was ending the way days end when they have been full of the right things, not dramatically, not with summary, just with the quiet, gradual arrival of dark that follows light the way it always has, without needing to announce itself. He reached over and took her hand. She turned her palm up to meet his. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the bench held.